Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 292 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on the 14th of June, 2025. This is the official podcast for the fan site AvatarTheLastAirbenderOnline.com, and I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg 2B from the site.
Up, everyone.
Excellent. So, on today's show, of course, we're going to go over some news, and then we're also going to be continuing our rewatches for Avatar and Korra. This time out, we have K306 Old Wounds on the Korra side of things in Book 3. And with Avatar, we have 219, The Guru, right at the end of Book 2, Earth. But we'll get straight into the news here because we have some pretty interesting and important stuff here, actually. I suppose we'll start with maybe the smaller one, but it's also probably the most recent kind of news that happened here, and that is this kind of interesting merchandise collaboration thing here. Avatar skateboards, basically, with the skateboard company Bearwalker. It's an interesting one because it does seem to be exclusive to the United States and Canada rather than like available everywhere thing, and it's maybe not a giant kind of brand to be collaborating with, but still, like, it's an interesting one here where they did a lot of Instagram kind of videos and posts about this, and actually there's quite a lot of stuff here. So they've got the really fancy perfectly kind of crafted board that's kind of shaped like Appa and has kind of a lot going on with it, but then they have like blind box, more normal skateboards. They have like grip tape that you can get. It's actually a pretty cool collaboration, and they have like other bits of merchandise as well, like t-shirts and so on. It's obviously, if you're into skateboarding, like and it's available in your region, it's like, hey, there's some interesting stuff here. But Greg, any thoughts on Avatar skateboards here?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's pretty cool. As someone who does skateboard, I've followed Bearwalker for a while. They've done a lot of collaborations, as you can see on their site, from other different sort of brands and stuff. So yeah, they're definitely not sort of like a bigger brand, but their boards are really nice and they're really custom and handcrafted. They are quite expensive as well. So even if you do have access to them in your region, they're not your typical like $60 decks or anything like that. I think even the blind box ones are 110 USD. So they're definitely up there. They're definitely more for show rather than potentially using, depending on, sort of how beat up you want your board to get. But no, they look awesome. The Appa one looks pretty cool. Even though you might wonder like how functional they actually are, from what I've seen from their past boards, they're actually very well sort of made, so they can take a good bit of damage. So they look so nice, you probably don't want to. But no, it's awesome. And yeah, they have the grip tape and everything else. So yeah, it's definitely awesome if you're into skateboarding.
Yeah, it's interesting because looking at the blind box one, it even says that there's two one-of-one boards, like Moon and Ocean Spirit. There's only one of them kind of available, and then they have like 1,000 of the kind of standard element ones, 500 of the hollow fires, and then there's like Aang, Koizilla, Avatar State Aang. It's interesting because we have this kind of happening just in general with Avatar as we're kind of ramping up into things getting kind of bigger and bigger, and you see the collabs are being done more regularly with smaller companies, bigger companies, like a lot of stuff maybe we don't cover here on the podcast. Like there's been Avatar like makeup collaborations like once or twice over the last couple of years, and even some of the books we're maybe not going to go into a lot of depth on here that like they just announced like an Avatar coloring book. There's that Avatar paint with water book coming out from Thunder Bay Press. They recently announced Avatar Amigurumi book, which is basically like crocheting, but you're making like the characters. That's something that's coming from Inside Editions, and it's like, okay, even if you think like, oh, the delay was a big disaster for Avatar, all this other stuff is happening that kind of highlights that like the franchise is in a pretty good spot because a lot of this other stuff continues to happen in the background. Like it's not just we're dead for like a year until like stuff starts to ramp up. Look at all this kind of stuff happening here. But what are your thoughts on that? Just where the franchise is with all these kind of collabs that we continue to see.
Yeah. I mean, I think Avatar has always been pretty good about having like even the smaller level sort of collaborations. Sometimes they, sort of get mixed in the weeds because, different things happen with the licensing and agreements and stuff like that. But there's always been, random sort of like side, things that have been coming out as sort of, I guess the bigger ones that sort of get held up by sort of like the show and, all that sort of stuff and the sort of media sort of tie-in things. But a lot of these independent projects do, pretty well on their own just on the strength of, the brand itself and how recognizable it is. So yeah, I would expect a lot of these smaller projects to do, generally pretty well, especially, depending on who they're targeted to and stuff like that.
Next piece of news on the kind of smaller side of things, but still kind of interesting because we're going to see this a few more times, but this is the first time we're going to see it. This is the collection of Avatar one-shot number 4, 5, and 6. So that's Azula and the Spirit Temple, Bounty Hunter and the Tea Brewer, and Ashes of the Academy. They are calling this 3 collected together. The first 3, again, was Team Avatar Treasury. This one is called Fire and Family Treasury. And so what we have here announced is the boxed set. So we were wondering if they were going to do this again after the first one, where it's just the 3 individual comics in a box set, which has the new cover on the slipcase, but it also comes with a poster. They are in fact doing it again, but at least now we have the information from the Team Avatar Treasury releases that they're still doing hardcovers, they're still doing the omnibus edition for that. So we didn't know that when the first box set was announced. We know that now, so I think people can make a better, more informed buying decision on this. Still, very cool to see the new cover, the kind of montage of the different books all kind of mashed together. We have Azula, of course, Iroh and June. We have May and Zuko on the cover there, in addition to the key locations in each of the books that make this up. So what are your thoughts on this? Like a bunch of things to talk about here. The box sets continuing, but just like the naming and the cover for this new set.
I mean, the cover is awesome. I think they did a really good job with that. So I think it's good that they're, collecting these into groupings and stuff like that. Because otherwise, sometimes they feel a bit sort of like isolated and there isn't sort of like a overall plan for how they're going to release them sometimes. But no, I think this is cool. I think it definitely, helps if you sort of like waited, to get them and you wanted to get them all sort of together in one go. It definitely, seems like this would be the sort of better option if you want, sort of the trade versions of them and you don't necessarily want the hardback ones, but you still want them all together. So no, I think this is a nice collection for them for sure.
Fire and Family as the name, I think it's always going to be difficult to come up with a name for these, especially once you get past the obvious ones, like it's the female Team Avatar members. This one roughly fits, but maybe family is kind of stretching it as like a theme of like all of the books. But like it's still kind of there because it's like Azula is kind of thinking about her friends and family and their thoughts on her. May's family is kind of in the book at the start. Zuko's family is more of the kind of the focus there. And then on the June side of things, her family is like kind of involved more so. I think it's fine. The whole idea of these one shots is that like I think the theming across the 3 of them is always going to be like a little bit light. It's not like super interconnected because the books themselves aren't like directly connected in that way.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing it'll be a little bit more vague as we go forward, and not like, I don't know, it depends on who they do for the next couple, but like maybe they might do a non-bender set, and what are they going to call it, the non-bender treasury or something like that. But do you have any thoughts on the title they've used for this second trilogy?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think, Fire and Family, those are the overall sort of the big arching themes that they're sort of going for, even if, the specific details in each one is a bit sort of limited. I mean, I think, just having it being, fire alone, I think is enough, just because that's sort of the main focus of the characters there. So for the most part, that sort of title works for me. I definitely can see how, that could be a bit hard, like you're saying, going forward if they're not sort of as well connected to each other. I don't know. I mean, I think if they have this in mind when they start making these books going forward, especially since they're only doing sort of one shots, I think they potentially could, better theme them together since they're sort of planning them out now and stuff like that. So I don't know. I think there's some hope that they could sort of, actually sort of key them in together, even if they're not, directly interconnected. But who knows? Maybe they'll do something like that going forward.
Yeah, and this is out September 16th, so they've actually fitted in like fairly close to the release of Ashes of the Academy, so they seem to be on it a little bit better about getting the different editions out. So there's that. And then we get into the two kind of bigger pieces of news. So we'll actually start with this. So preview pages, finally, for Beasts of the Four Nations. Nerdist got the exclusive on this. We have 7 preview pages here, showing off at last what the kind of layout of this book is going to be. And interestingly, the response to this maybe hasn't been like super positive. I'm not going to say it's been negative, but it's people going a lot of like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing it in this way? There's some interesting stuff to talk about, both in terms of the art presentation, but also the text presentation of the book, because we've had so many years to think about what exactly they're going to do here, and everyone had it in their heads that this is going to be, it's an Avatar encyclopedia / art book, so it's just going to be great full color art the whole book and just fact files basically on the animals. And instead we find out that most of the book is going to be narrated by Aang. So it's going to be Aang kind of writing the entries for most of these animals, with kind of interjections from other characters depending on the animal. And then the book itself seems to be mostly laid out like it's a kind of in-universe artifact journal, where a lot of the pages seem to have black and white sort of sketch style art, but then there are some pages that have the art in color, and then some pages where it's just a full color piece of art. And I think the general response I've seen is just that it feels like a kind of oddly messy way to do the book, because the book is called Beasts of the Four Nations, Creatures from Avatar, The Last Airbender, and Legend of Korra, but they seem to be doing it in such a way where like this sets it in the ATLA era, even though there's Korra animals. Now, we haven't seen any of the specific Korra animals, like the polar bear dog page, to see like what way that's done. Like, is Aang going to talk about polar bear dogs? Is Korra going to have an insert on that page? We don't know how that's going to work, but there's a bit of a like, I didn't think it being written by the characters was even a thing in the first place. So before we get into talking about specifics of the pages, what are your thoughts just on, hey, we finally know what this book is going to be done like?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice after all these years to finally get some actual information on the book and not just sort of hearsay from, various artists and, other places that haven't really been confirmed 100%. So it's nice that they did finally do, a release, and that we're actually sort of, have a actual idea of when we're actually going to get it. But the overall sort of, I guess you could say, idea of it, I definitely can see why after all this time, and part of it might just be because, like you said before, like we've been thinking about this for so long, so we've had in our minds sort of the idea of what this book would actually sort of be, which of course was sort of based off of what they told us initially about it. So it's not like we made it up 100%. We did know about this book. It's not like it's coming out of nowhere, all of these ideas that we have, but it has been so much time, so it definitely has sort of changed overall. And I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting the way that they're going about it overall without, getting too much detail. I mean, they did have that one other sort of book that was sort of set sort of in universe and was sort of like a pass down, and it was basically sort of like a scrapbook type of style, with art and articles and stuff like that. So I don't know. This feels like it's sort of like in the vein of that other book that they did, which I don't think many people were very sort of interested in as well. So I don't know why they particularly would sort of follow that route again after that one, wasn't as well received as maybe they thought it would be. So it definitely feels like an interesting way for them to actually choose about going about it, since, animals are sort of such a huge part of the Avatar world that you would think that they would, sort of key in on sort of what people sort of really thought, they wanted from this sort of, binding book that we could potentially like reference, basically. But it definitely doesn't necessarily come across, directly like that sort of text.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, yeah, like you say, it's being done like the kind of Avatar Legacy books, which I think people like, but they're not like packed with as much new information as you think. And that's understandable because that's coming from like Inside Editions, and it's a lower kind of tier of book, whereas this is basically an equivalent to an art book, which are some of the most kind of high-end kind of releases that we've ever got for Avatar. And it's there, obviously, in terms of like the amount of pieces of art, I guess, that we're getting, and the fact that there is all this kind of original text. But the text itself, as we'll kind of talk about a little bit here, is really weak and not really filled with information, which I think is the problem here. And it's kind of, I think, a bad thing with the book here, that the better comparison to this is probably less animal encyclopedia and more like the flavor text from that cookbook that we got like a few years back, which also didn't have that much new information in it.
Yeah.
It's just, okay, the characters are in character, but he's sort of just rambling about something that doesn't really have much going on, which I think the first 2 pages highlight. There's 2 pages here about dragons, narrated by Aang, no interjections from other characters. There's no full color piece of art for dragons on this page. Now, we don't know if this is the full section on dragons. There might be a color spread on the next page. We just don't get to see it here. But I think animals, as like one of the cover animals, one of the most notable animals in Avatar, this is a weird thing to have, just these kind of parchment colored pages. Aang just basically talking about how we can't talk about dragons or the Sun Warriors, and that just gets done over and over again. In the middle, there's like a little bit of an attempt to kind of give you some information, because they reference like, oh, multiple avatars in the past have had dragons as familiars, which we kind of know already. Roku, and then from the novels we know Zito had a dragon at some point, even though we don't know the full details about that. They go into a little bit of the whole Sozin thing without actually referencing Sozin. But ultimately, it's just a big joke about how Aang is kind of talking about this, even though he's not meant to talk about this, but he doesn't say anything about the dragons. And so it just feels like there's no actual information on the dragons here at all. Even though Aang has met dragons prior to the Ancient Sun Warrior thing because of the Dragon Days comic, where he met a green dragon. He literally held a dragon egg in his hand. So there's some weird stuff here in terms of just, I've not really seen anyone talk about how they're super impressed by these pages on the dragons. And it doesn't speak maybe well of the whole book that one of your main event animals is kind of being done like this. What are your thoughts on what the book has to say about dragons?
Yeah, I don't know. It almost feels like it's a way to sort of get out of actually saying anything, because, in universe is sort of like a hidden secret thing, how the dragons sort of survived and their existence and stuff like that, which, if this was purely sort of like a in-universe book, no, that would totally make sense. Like, you would want to keep the information on the down low and just sort of speak of, past events and stuff like that. But like you said, the fact that we're getting it from sort of our main character who has interacted with them, and I guess maybe the original thought idea of this book, which may have been wrong on our part, was sort of to actually have like, learn stuff about these creatures that we wouldn't otherwise know from just sort of watching the show. It definitely does feel like it's lacking in that regard. And yeah, there may be more of it, but it doesn't, I don't know, the way that they seem to have things set up with the pages that they have shared with us so far, it doesn't particularly feel like it's going in that particular route, which is, I guess okay if that's what they had always sort of intended, but it definitely, after all this time, feels like it's lacking a bit.
Yeah, because most of it reads more like, oh, this animal. What episode was this animal in? Let's write the text referencing what that animal did in that episode, and then we probably need a little bit more, so let's just like have a line about they live in the southern part of this continent or something like that, rather than like go on from there, talk a bit more about this, more details. But no. And especially with the dragons, it's like the era that they're kind of talking about it in, that like if this text was written by Korra era Zuko, where he has his own dragon, I think this reads very differently, because, okay, he might still want to keep the Ancient Sun Warriors a secret, but then he has his own dragon to talk about. And the book does have Korra in the title, so it's like, I think a lot of people are worried about the whole, like, is Korra era stuff even getting, like, covered in this book, or what way will it be covered? because none of the preview pages really cover Korra animals necessarily, so we'll have to wait and see on that. Next page is for the Aardvark sloth, where they do actually on the kind of standard journal pages have a color piece of art for the Aardvark sloth as well as a kind of black and white one, so that's interesting. It will be interesting to see the layout on how much of it is full color versus how much of it isn't. Again, this is mostly, again, a reference to 213, that the entire animal's kind of profile is it likes to lick the goo stuff that the Ancient Sun Warriors use, and there's a vague sense that, oh, they live in these fire islands, and that's about it. It's really just Aang's personal experience with the animal rather than anything actually about the animal. So yeah, it's a weird one where like it feels like the entry is more about the Sun Warrior slime than the animal itself. But what are your thoughts on the Aardvark sloth?
Yeah, no, it feels really just like on Aang just sort of reporting his very limited time with them, which is fine. Again, that's sort of the point of view that they're going for here. But again, yeah, like it's not anything that we don't really already know. I mean, other than, sort of getting the visuals of them, in a better sort of view, which is cool. Like it definitely is nice to see. Yeah, it's just not much there. If this is the only page on them that we're getting, at least.
Mm-hmm. Then there's a 2-page section on the Dragon Hawk, so like Hawkeye. And again, they highlight that, of course, they're messenger hawks, and I'm guessing like the book seems to be separated into, there's a section at the start on domesticated animals, and then I think it seems like the second half of the book is on wild animals. So Dragonhawk is in the domesticated section, and it talks about it as a messenger hawk. There's a little bit kind of more detail here in the sense that like, oh, we can get to bossing say in a night type thing, and interestingly here, like they don't kind of directly reference Hawkeye as such, and they more are like, oh, Aang gets distracted and stops writing about it, which is like, I think that's a kind of terrible thing to put into the description, because that is literally just like, I don't read that as like Aang in character. That more reads as like a writer not wanting to put in any details. That might be a little bit harsh, but that's the way it kind of comes across to me. But what are your thoughts on the Dragonhawk page? And this is where we get the idea that there are pages of full color art as well. So the book is not just exclusively done on the sort of tan colored pages like we see for the rest of it. But what are your thoughts on the Dragonhawk?
Yeah, I mean, the full page art I think is awesome. So when we do get those pages, I think it's definitely going to be a sight to see. But yeah, I mean, again, it just feels like this isn't really an encyclopedia information of it. It really is just a short narrated story of a person who's encountered various animals and their experience with them across their lifetime. Which I don't know. I feel like this could have been done maybe in sort of like a different sort of novel type format or something like that, or a different type of set of book or whatever, and that would have been perfectly sort of fine. But sort of getting all sort of encompassing sort of information on animals, I definitely can see where that feels like it just didn't have any other information that they wanted to write about it, or they just felt that that was enough as is, which if that is, then that, it just feels like it's lacking then.
Mm-hmm. Next page is on the Komodo rhino, which is one of the early animals from Avatar. And this is probably the worst page because it's Aang writing about them, and it's literally just that they're used in the military, their hide is strong, it's so strong, it can be hit by weapons, and the weapons break. And it's like, come on. Any history, like, where are they from? When did the Fire Nation military start using them? Like, how historically incorporated into the military have they been? This is literally just, okay, yeah, I got this from the episode. It's a big, tough animal, being a big, tough animal. Like, because it doesn't really explain much about, like, say, like, that reads like a rhino. What about the Komodo dragon aspect of this animal? No details? Maybe there's a second page, but I don't take it to be that way. And yet, no color piece of art here, though the black and white piece of art is actually really nice. But I just find that to be such a weird choice, where the book is kind of like half wanting to be the in-universe thing, but then it has the full color pages where it's clearly not being that. It just feels messy and almost reads like there was kind of like actual production problems with this book, maybe explaining why it's been so heavily delayed. But what are your thoughts on the Komodo Rhino page?
Yeah, no, I wonder about that, if it's just sort of production of it over time has sort of mixed things up. But yeah, I mean, it does feel very sort of short. And I don't know, maybe it's because we saw like, a decent amount of them that we would think that there's more to them, their history and their use case and stuff like that. So it feels like there would be more to them because they are so heavily used. We've seen them multiple times throughout the show and stuff like that. And some of the most popular sort of like side characters use them as like their main, mode of transportation. So I don't know. It feels like there would be more to them than what we're getting here, which is just, unfortunate. I don't know why it seems like the ones that we see the most, we get the least amount of information on.
Mm-hmm. And then the final page is on the Croco Cat, which I do like the joke at the start that, hey, this is a Croco Cat, not a cat gator. That, like, I guess there is a page on the cat gator at a different point. And again, if you read the comic where the Croco Cat's kind of introduced in, like, this is pretty obvious because it's referencing the Pebble. And this is the first time we actually see a page with one of the other character inserts. And it's from the expected character, because, like, the Boulder owns the Pebble, who is a cat gator, a Croco Cat. And it just says the Boulder can neither confirm nor deny that he has a pet Croco Cat named the Pebble, who he loves very much. I was like, okay, that's fine. But, like, is that going to be it for, like, a lot of these other animals where, like, I guess Saber-tooth Moose Line, they're going to have a Sokka insert? Is that going to be it?
Yeah,
or, like,
yeah.
Can other characters write the full entry if required? That's going to be, like, the interesting kind of part about this. Again, we do get the full color image as well as a black and white image. So that's kind of interesting. But what are your thoughts on this page for domesticated animals?
Yeah, I mean, it's cool. This is probably one that I could say, a lot of people might not really know that much about it, because it's only been in some other media. So it has, it's worth in being here and stuff like that. So it's cool that we have it here. The art looks awesome. Again, the text isn't that much, but I don't know, maybe that's all they really need for it in this case here. But yeah, it definitely feels like I don't know, could there be more that they could sort of add to this? But the insert is cool, and yeah, I would definitely expect inserts for other, characters and stuff like that, which, I don't know, I feel like maybe if it was done more sort of like narrated type way and then had those insert, maybe it might be a little bit more interesting, because then we wouldn't sort of like expect to have, these random character inserts, like if Toph was talking about like the badger moles and her experience with them when she was like really young or something like that, or Prince Wu and his experience with them, if they're, putting core characters in these inserts. Stuff like that would be, a nice sort of icing on top. But here it just feels like they're just sort of filling it in. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how that balances out, throughout the whole book.
Yeah, because I do think that's the big question coming out of this. For, I suppose, especially, say, like, the polar bear dog page and the fire ferret page. Like, how's Aang going to talk about those two animals? Like, he didn't encounter them. Like, his only experience with, like, a polar bear dog is, like, what the Karuk kind of hide that he wears, which is a bit, like, morbid. So, like, and it would be really weird for Aang to do the entry and then Korra to have the insert, unless they really do a good job at the start of the book about explaining that, like, it's a journal of Aang's that has been passed through the eras, and so this is why Korra era characters comment on it as well. And then, yeah, Bolin kind of has to be the one commenting on fire ferrets, surely. How do you think they're going to do Korra stuff, given that technically on nearly every page of the book it says Legend of Korra at, like, the top, so it's kind of weird, the lack of Korra so far.
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if they're just like holding those sections back because they just didn't want to preview those yet. But yeah, I don't know. It would be cool if they were able to do something where they like swap over and it is across the eras. I think, that's a nice way to do it. I think, it still might have been cooler if they had it more sort of like formalized encyclopedia rather than sort of journalized encyclopedia. But, get work potentially, depending on how they do the stories and stuff like that. But I don't know. Even if we do get sort of the other characters, doing their respective pages and that stuff, I mean, it doesn't feel like it would be, a lot of information that they would gather, that we would get from them. Like they still would probably be pretty sort of surface level the way that everything's been written so far. So I don't know, even if those characters do, speak to them, would we get any, additional in-depth sort of information on them? I don't know. I would suspect not.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one where, like, the book's out in September. I'm still excited for it, but the preview pages have definitely kind of taken some of that hype away, where I think there was the expectation that this could be one of the highlights of the year. And now it kind of feels like it's a little bit more in the situation where it's just another book, because this is sort of the quality of the text that we've seen so far, that, this might end up having equivalent information to the Avatar bakery book that's coming out in around the same time, I think. Now, we don't know that book's going to have flavor text like the cookbook, but I assume it will. And that's kind of the problem here, I think, with how long we've been waiting for it. I think we expected it to be a little bit more than this, but it's still 128 pages where there's going to be lots of new art. So I don't know. I'm just interested, especially with like what the breakdown on like how much color art is there versus non-color art, and the decision making there seems really odd because it looks like it's about half and half so far. But what are your thoughts now? Kind of the book's out in about 3 months. Where are you at now that we actually have seen a bit of it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think after all this time in general, sort of my hype for it has definitely sort of waned over time. I don't know. I think it's definitely, for me, it's definitely one of those books that I would have to sort of wait and see what people say about it. Check it out in store if I can find it. To really get a good idea of it before sort of purchasing it and adding it to sort of my collection. But yeah, I don't know. Definitely can see why people would be sort of, not as enthused about it as we might have once been, many years ago.
Final piece of news is another big one. We finally have proper information on the Book 2 Earth soundtrack, which we've had teased since like February with the big anniversary press release. Finally, we have the details on it, though I will say straight away that they've not been great about maybe like making a big deal about the news, which has been kind of weird. So what the information is from this week's Brave and the Elements podcast, where they had Jeremy Zuckerman on to talk about the music, but also to review episode 3 of Korra. They did reveal right at the start, the Book 2 Earth soundtrack is coming out digitally to all the typical platforms on July 25th. So the audio podcast came out quite early that day, and we just had that information. Then on the video version of the same podcast, while they were talking about this, they did actually show off the cover art for the Book 2 Earth soundtrack, which is really cool. It's Aang in the Avatar state, kind of crystal, catacomb, light. It looks really, really cool. Then they also revealed that, like with the Book 1 soundtrack, there is going to be a single from the album released early. And that was Secret Tunnel, which we have already. It came out on Friday. So we have the full album version of Secret Tunnel already, with the full soundtrack coming on July 25th. The weird part about this is that outside of the single, they've not really overly pushed the information about the actual release date of the soundtrack. It's like Jeremy Zuckerman almost forgot that it was revealed on the podcast that he was on. So it hasn't really been posted about all that much, and it kind of feels like it's almost this weird hidden information, even though it's a notable release, and it's not that far away either. But what are your thoughts here? We finally have the Book 2 Earth soundtrack 2 years on from the release of the first one. I don't think we expected it to take that long, but finally coming out with a single.
Yeah, I mean, it's awesome that it's finally here. I think that's really cool, and many people be really enjoyed to have, the official soundtrack and to see, what they've done to update it and how it fits in line with, the actual sort of, productions and stuff like that. So it's definitely nice that we're getting it, but it definitely feels, odd in how they're sort of talking about it or not talking about it. You would think it would be lot more news about it maybe than it really is, but I don't know, maybe we're just sort of missing it or something like that. But yeah, I don't I'm looking forward to it coming out and being able to listen to it.
Yeah, the other stuff is that, like, so far we don't have details on what the physical release is going to be like. We know there is a vinyl coming because Jeremy Zucker's been doing like a competition thing for the Book 2 vinyl before they'd even properly announced Book 2, the soundtrack. And I think he more recently posted on Instagram about getting like a test copy of the vinyl. Um, there was also a CD release for the Book 1 soundtrack that came out well after the fact. So we don't know for like Book 2 Earth if the CD release is going to be at the same time as everything else, or if the physical releases in general are going to be after the digital release right now. Like, I think we're definitely missing like a press release about this that has more of the clear-cut information, and they're obviously waiting for some reason to do that. I think they usually have a second single. I think there was a second piece of music for Book 1 that came out. Maybe they'll do it in or around then. But yeah, we're like, what, 6 weeks away, give or take, from this. So it's not too far away. But finally, it's going to be out, and it is pretty exciting. I've listened to the Secret Tunnel single a couple of times. It's nice, but like it's not like it's the full version of Secret Tunnel in that, like, Chong still says, like, I forget the lines. It's just he says Secret Tunnel like a lot more, and it's just kind of edited in a kind of specific way. It's really nice. You can tell there are kind of updates to it overall, so that is cool. But yeah, do you have any thoughts on Secret Tunnel?
You know, I mean, I don't know. For me, I think it's pretty cool. I like how it fits with sort of the actual sort of live production that they've done. So I think, you can see, the comparison and the tweaks and stuff like that they've done. So, it's not, even from, the original one that we got, they've always done things, to sort of update and change it. And not everyone likes those changes, of course. Some things sort of get missed or updated or, removed for whatever sort of, reasons that they have for, adjusting the music and stuff like that. So there are differences, to sort of keep in mind there compared to, sort of the other unofficial ones and stuff like that. But no, overall for me, I like it.
But yeah, that has been all of the news. We're waiting, of course, for, like, we're expecting probably San Diego Comic-Con schedule to come out in the next couple of weeks. That's happening, of course, next month. I'm not sure what Avatar Studios stuff we're expecting, but certainly we anticipate a publishing panel where Dark Horse will have to say something, because they don't really have any new books on the schedule, and they kind of need to say something, especially now that they've basically announced a lot of their reprint books already. It's just, what's the new stuff? That's kind of what we're waiting for. The toy line should be getting, I suppose, properly detailed at some point soon from Jazzwares. We're definitely waiting to see what the full, like, situation is on that. And then there is other stuff that I guess details will come out on in the next couple of weeks as well. Like, probably like the first look at maybe some of the products for, like, Avatar Magic the Gathering. That will be pretty big when it happens, because, like, the Final Fantasy set just came out yesterday, so stuff like that's kind of happening. But yeah, we're just waiting for news, but it probably will be a while before we get, like, really, really, really big stuff. But from there, we'll move into our reviews for the episode. And so we're going to start with the Korra episode this time out, and that is K306 Old Wounds. So we're towards the middle of Book 3 Change. And we're in, of course, this Zaofu Metal Clan arc here. And here's the kind of second of the initial kind of introduction arc episodes. I would say that this is probably my favorite Book 3 episode, just because I really like the backstory. I think there's a lot of great character stuff just consistently throughout the episode with Lin, Sue, Bolin, Opal. They do some really great stuff here, I think, just across the board, to the point where arguably the Red Lotus part of the episode is probably the weakest section, even though it's still a fun kind of like escape sequence for them. I just like that there's actually a little bit of time to just focus on the characters in this one without chaos kind of happening overall. There's a lot of interesting stuff because we really get into the weeds on the backstory. Toph gets brought up. We get to see Toph in the past, and just, the character focus and talking about their character arcs is really nice, I think, in this one. But what are your thoughts on Old Wound?
Yeah, I think whenever you can get, episode that really focuses on the history of our characters and then does a really good job of actually showing it, a lot of those episodes do really well, and this one is not an exception to that. I think, and being, a fan favorite character to get more information on her and, the whole Toph family, no, I think that's just like a winning combination. You get stuff from the past, you get the current, whereabouts of characters. So yeah, no, I think overall it's a really fun episode. And yeah, the Red Lotus does get sort of, backpedaled in this one, but you can still see that, things are going on, things are moving along. So it's not like a completely like static episode. There are many different, moving pieces happening, but it does definitely give us a little bit of time to sort of breathe and enjoy characters and just, learn about metal itself and how, metal bending works and stuff like that. I think even just getting the little bits of that and well as, Olin's troubles with that is a nice touch.
We'll actually start with the Red Lotus stuff just to kind of get it out of the way here. But yeah, we see that the Zahir and Co are kind of hanging out in this kind of spirit vine infested apartment right in the middle of Republic City. Their big thing here is that they want to get out of the city, that they're deciding to do that, versus what Ghazan says, which is that, hey, I thought we were going to take out the president. And so, again, at this point in the series, we don't actually know what their goals are, what they're really trying to accomplish. So it's like, wait, in the background, you considered taking out, like, and we later learned that they literally mean killing President Raiko. But they're prioritizing something else over that, getting out, and I suppose going after Korra first. And so they're going to steal this van to kind of make their way out of the city, because otherwise they're a pretty noticeable group with how giant and tall of course Pali is, and I guess they're kind of on the lookout for someone like Zahir because of what he just did. So it's an interesting situation as they have to kind of go undercover here just to walk out of Republic City because of the security. But what are your thoughts on the opening Red Lotus scene here, where we do get a hint into what they're about without properly explaining it to us?
Yeah, no, I think, it's interesting that we get even just that little bit, from the beginning, because before you're sort of really aware of the Red Lotus and what they're doing, you just, sort of understand that they're a powerful group and that they have, the ability to sort of topple governments, either as a group or even, sort of individual, from what we've heard before from characters like Zuko. So they actually get to see that they're, this is something that they were considering and something they probably could have, done rather easily. It's definitely something to make you sort of, stand up and sort of take notice, more or less. That's the whole point of, them sort of bringing up at this point in time, and the fact that they're willing to just sort of let this go because, in their mind, they have, bigger fish to fry.
The second scene with the Red Lotus is that the driver, they actually keep on board to try and keep it really undercover. They actually have him drive them out, kind of what they're threatening him. And he doesn't handle the lying to the security particularly well, so they inspect the van and they have to burst out, jump into action. Minghua ends up somehow, out of all the characters, being the one to drive the car, which is funny with her kind of water arms, but she does quite well. As they burst their way across the bridge to kind of make their way out of the city here, including Ghazan using lava to kind of block the way. So you kind of see how powerful they are, even just with a little bit of action here, but just, trying to get out to safety without causing too much of a stir, but they accomplish it overall. So it's not a giant action set piece, but it's a nice one just at the start of the bridge there. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
It's just, it's interesting just to see I don't know, how they use their skills together in sort of like, a cohesive way. I think that's probably, the strength of seeing them overall is just how well they can, work together, especially with, Zahir, now having airbending, and sort of what he brings to the group now. But each of them, they have, really quick ways of using their abilities that, you might not necessarily think of, but they're still, all rather quite destructive in what they're doing, even if this is just them sort of on their way out of a place, like they are, completely sort of unchallenged.
The final scene with them is that they park the van up, they're camping out, they're kind of free, but they are looking for what to do next, which seems to be a focus on hunting down Korra. They're like, hey, do we even know where they are? Police says, oh, he knows, like he'll tell us. And we cut over to Zahir, who is kind of meditating. He then comes out of the meditation and just straight up reveals Korra is with the Metal Clan. So he knows exactly where she is. And there's obviously the implication, without properly revealing it now, that, oh, he was meditating. Was he in the spirit world or something like that? Like, that hasn't been revealed to us yet. So it's a bit like up in the air what's happening. It turns out that is exactly what's happening here. It's actually, he's gone into the spirit world to communicate with Ai Wei, who's Red Lotus, which we'll learn in a couple of episodes. But it's interesting to look back on it like, oh yeah, this was kind of a bit of a mystery kind of cliffhanger of like, how did he know that? Was it super obvious that he was doing some sort of spirit world shenanigans? But he was in fact doing that. So it focuses the Red Lotus back on, well, I think what was always meant to be the case. He's after the Avatar. That's the setup that we had. They tried to capture her when she was younger. They're going after her again, even above other world leaders. We still don't know the full details about the group. We'll learn that in like 2 episodes time, but we're slowly getting there. Where like the focus for the Red Lotus has up to now just been, here's their introduction. They've broken out. They've got some information, and now they're about to execute their plan. But what are your thoughts on this final Red Lotus scene?
Just remember that being very sort of curious, sort of what is he doing? How does he just sort of, randomly sort of notice? And, he feels, he's surprising that he would be, spiritually inclined, despite sort of their goals of anarchy and whatnot. But, the idea that he has, sort of additional sort of abilities and sort of knowledge, I guess it sort of fits in line with his sort of, somewhat enlightenment sort of ideas and stuff like that. So no, I thought this was curious to see where, this leads to in the end.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's the Red Lotus plot. Let's go into the metal bending plot that we have here. Again, it's one of the smaller plots in the episode, but it's quite interesting. Where straight away the topic of metal bending comes up. Interestingly, Sue is like, oh wait, you don't know how to metal bend. They assume she already does because she's close with Lin. Like, Lin didn't offer to teach you, and it's just that Korra never even like considered it, basically, because as we find out, she goes on to become the first metal bending avatar in this episode. So it literally just didn't cross her mind. But we bring up this other kind of plot point that Bolin is actually quite interested in learning how to metal bend, but he's also hesitant about even starting in case it turns out that he kind of literally can't metal bend. He doesn't want that hope that he has to kind of fall away completely. But we see that Sue is actually a very open teacher kind of across a lot of these scenes that we get here. Bolin brings up stuff later on in the episode, such as like in his mind, what he's heard, only 1 in 100 earthbenders can metal bend. Sue says that, not to believe everything he hears, because her assumption is just that like anyone who can earthbend can metal bend with the right training, seems to be the idea. And we start the earthbending training by using the meteorite stuff, which is very, very interesting, where apparently the meteorite metal is easier to metal bend for beginner metal benders, and Korra actually grasps it quite quickly early on. We'll get to more of the Bolin focus, I suppose, afterwards, but just what are your thoughts on some of this kind of intro to metal bending we get here with Korra beginning her training under Sue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty cool. I guess, considering that it's such a specialized skill, maybe it's not too surprising that, an avatar wouldn't particularly focus on it, especially sort of like in their beginning when they're, sort of learning the elements, considering, Korra was sort of stuck on airbending for like forever, sort of, really getting that down, you could see why maybe she wouldn't necessarily, think about branching out to the other sort of more specialized element. But of course, Korra's Korra, and she's always willing to learn anything that can, help her in a battle or a fight or anything like that. So from that aspect, it would make sense that Korra would eventually learn it. And, we can see where she ends up with it, later on, which is pretty cool to see from her beginnings now to where she eventually ends up with it. So yeah, I mean, I think, it's something that I guess just because you're close with people that are really, really, really good in airbend or in metal bending doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to learn or really want to spend the time on learning that skill. They do mention how Korra was so busy with just sort of her avatar duties that she really didn't have the time. And again, Lynn necessarily wouldn't be one to sort of offer that up, at least not until her sort of mellows out a bit. So I guess it's not too surprising that she wouldn't be the one to sort of offer up and teach it. So unless Cora were to ask, it makes sense that she wouldn't necessarily know. But it's cool that Sulin does take her down and teaches her sort of the basics and the whole idea of most Earthbenders can sort of learn it, which is something interesting to keep in mind considering how we thought it was when Toph invented it, right?
Yeah, it is actually interesting. There's a few interesting ties between our Avatar and Korra episodes today, where we have the debut of metal bending in the Avatar episode, which we'll get to. Also, interestingly, two characters recovering from like doing something crazy, repressed memories, making the right decisions, and then waking up oddly cheerful, like because of their kind of chi being cleared up. That's an interesting one with Lin and Zuko as well. But yeah, metal bending focus is obviously quite interesting here, and it's interesting as well because it kind of connects as well to like what we learned from like the Promise comics of like Toph explaining to us how she found her initial metal bending students, that her meteorite bracelet is the thing that would like interact with earthbenders who would get like emotional, and anyone who could affect the meteorite bracelet is someone who has the potential for metal bending. Which makes sense, of course, that like without knowing that you can metal bend, if you can kind of inadvertently bend the meteorite thing, it obviously highlights that that's an easily bendable thing. Which is funny because otherwise meteorite metal is presented as like the ultimate metal, that like Sokka's space sword is like the best thing ever, but apparently it's like completely weak, like it's even weaker than a normal sword to metal benders. Like you can just turn it into like putty basically. It's just a fun kind of comparison here of just it's got unique properties as a sword, just don't use it against metal benders basically. But I suppose a metal bender using a meteorite sword themselves would be cool. But it's interesting just in that regard. And then yeah, with Bolin and the whole arc that they go on here, it's interesting that they seem to settle on the idea that because he eventually is revealed to be a lava bender, that either he has to focus on that so he can never learn metal bending, or just he can't metal bend, in that we still have no character who can lava bend, metal bend, and earth bend, all the kind of different forms. Which is odd because, of course, Bolin is technically even more special because he can lava bend, which is the kind of even more exclusive skill. Whereas they are presenting metal bending like kind of lightning, where once you have the correct teaching, you can learn it. So, like, I don't think they're ruling out that Bolin can learn it. It's just that I guess his approach, his philosophy leans more towards lava bending, which I've always viewed as being like, well, he's able to adapt his bending to earth in a kind of flowy, liquidy state, but maybe the most solid form of earth, metal bending, is not quite in his kind of wheelhouse in that regard, or what. But what way do you interpret that, the arc here, where like, oh, Bolin, he really wants to be a metal bender, his hero Toph, he wants to learn metal bending, he can't, but actually he has the rarer technique, but he never goes back to learn metal bending. What's your take on what they kind of settle on with that?
Yeah, no, that is something to note with him and his character. And I don't know, I always wondered if that was like part of his heritage, because of his, his parents and sort of their background, half earth, half fire, and that sort of thing. So that was sort of the reason why he was able to sort of, adapt more easily to the lava, even though we know that firebenders can't really do anything with lava except for like converting the heat properties of it, at least as far as we can tell, except for the avatar, because they can do anything, of course, pretty much. So yeah, it definitely speaks to, is it sort of his personality that sort of is sort of holding him back? And we know Bolin's sort of character, he has had those sort of hiccups and sort of downs and ups with his sort of personality. So I guess it wouldn't be too surprising to, sort of figure that that's something that plays into his sort of mentals and his abilities to sort of manipulate the elements and to sort of learn them in any sort of way. And, I wouldn't be surprised if he could learn metal bending. It might just take sort of like, extra set of effort. Because, we know that he's a talented earthbender. Like he has, very sort of strong command of Earth and has pinpoint precision as we'll see in later episodes as well. So he definitely has the skills and sort of the backing to sort of train and anything to sort of really get it up to whatever level that he really wanted to. But I think just part of the way that they wrote his character in the story, it's just not in the cards for him at this current time here. But it's interesting just to see that comparison between him and Korra and sort of their idea of sort of metal bending and sort of what it can do overall.
Yeah, because the difference of like these kind of fancy bending forms typically does seem to come down to sort of like raw kind of power level. Ultimately, that well, if you're powerful enough to do lava bending, there shouldn't really be anything holding you back from doing metal bending, because if you can wrap your head around the idea that this kind of liquid kind of hot stuff is actually earth, is it a stretch to say that like you can see the earth in the metal, the impurities in, especially like you say, given that Bolin is a quite precise earthbender with small pieces of earth. It kind of feels like that actually really fits him, but I'm guessing it just is a thing where like he is one of the few characters who has the technique. It's, I guess, a still evolving form of bending. He probably has his hands full just getting a mastery on that, especially because of how dangerous it is even to himself, constantly having to keep track of the heat, because even though he can make earth hot for lava, he's not like immune to it in that way. Kind of like firebenders can be burned, but they have an ability to defend against it in that way once they're kind of conscious. Bolin doesn't quite have it in that way, but it's interesting. We'll continue on with this. So Korra, they basically highlight is a natural. After just a couple of lessons, she seems to just really get the hang of things. Where we end, she kind of hasn't kind of moved on beyond most of the basics, but she seems to be able to manipulate metal pretty nicely by the end of the episode. It's just adapting to using it, I suppose, is the main thing. So that's cool. And I forget like how many more scenes there are of her like properly doing training, because she's definitely at the point where she's effectively like a master by the end of the series, certainly. So they seem to just, like they often do in Avatar, highlight that Korra's already mastered 4 elements, a subtype of another element that she's adapted to quite quickly. She's going to get it with just time. But what are your thoughts on just Korra, metal bending, and this being the start of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, also just, avatars in general, like, sort of, by default, at least from what we've seen so far, and what we've read in different stories, once they sort of start getting into the idea that they can manipulate other elements and stuff like that, like they're pretty much, automatically on like a fast track of like mastering them, or, at least getting up to some level of high proficiency in them, even if they're not considered like, a high-end master in whatever the other elements are. So yeah, I think, that makes sense for Korra and her sort of skills and her ability to adapt and learn things, like, even just her learning, different techniques and, whatever she's already been established in, she does them pretty quickly, right? So it's, I think that all sort of pans out, in my mind of how, the avatars sort of learn the elements. Even, Bolin makes note that, wow, you sort of, really picked that up really fast here, which, just sort of highlights, their characters and their personalities of any of the various avatars we've seen so far.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, on the Bolin side of things, a lot of the early scenes with him are just him being hesitant about even wanting to try, but clearly being interested, because like Korra's first lesson, Bolin's kind of hiding behind a rock listening in, and they give him the opportunity, but he kind of says no, and they just kind of highlight that no, it's not actually a 1 in 100, you can do it if you want to, but he thinks about like, what if I fail? And this sets up the kind of the main Bolin scene of the episode, which is he sneaks out on his own to try and metal bend the meteorite. He can't do it. Opal shows up and they have this very interesting talk where He's embarrassed about not being able to metal bend because he's been actually trying to do it his entire life, because he looks up to Toph as the inventor of metal bending so heavily. He really wants to be a metal bender. Opal says, like, hey, just try to do it, ask my mom for help, stop being so scared. He turns it around on her and being like, hey, you're too scared to ask your mom to kind of let you go to the Northern Air Temple, so come on, let's kind of both do this together type thing. And they do have this kind of nice bonding moment where they just acknowledge that, like, hey, they actually communicate quite well, being supportive to each other, and they have a nice kind of hug moment, kind of looking off into the distance. I really like this scene, again, kind of highlighting their difference in approach of doing the romances, in terms of less drama, more about two characters actually just connecting well. And this works really well for both character arcs, where Bolin needs the confidence to just try to metal bend, and Opal needs the confidence to do what she wants to do, and that being proper airbending training, not just training here in Zaofu. But what are your thoughts on this big scene, Bolin and Opal talking?
Yeah, no, this is a very nice scene, like you said there. It definitely, highlights their more supporting nature of their relationship, and how, once Opal sort of, calls Bolin out for acting weird, they're able to sort of really sort of discuss what's going on between the two of them, and, are able to sort of give them each other the confidence boost to sort of do what they really sort of want to do here. So yeah, it definitely feels like they just, I don't know if it's because of, sort of all the mess with the other relationship that they chose to go this route, or they just had it in their mind to just sort of, settle down with these two and, write the characters in this sort of way, which, feels, more, sort of down to earth, compared to what we've seen before.
Mm-hmm. And then the only other stuff with Bolin is that he, right before the Lin Su fight happens, he does go up to Su to ask for training. Again, he thinks there's going to be like a giant waiting list, but Su is like, no, we'll do it right now. But of course, Lin does interrupt the training, like, about to begin. So that's just a fun kind of little way to just kind of quickly put it on hold as a fight between sisters happens. But that brings us to, actually, I suppose, going into the kind of Lin side of the episode and setting up that fight at the end. So yeah, we saw this from the last episode, that Lin is struggling. She's walking around the place, she's kind of staggering, she's sweating. Her feelings about just dealing with this thing that, again, is 30 years in the making, is tearing her apart at this point. And she's kind of snapping at everyone. She's not kind of nice to be around right now. And this is where, out of nowhere, like, Aiwei appears to try and kind of calm her down. He can see it straight away that she is stressed and has to deal with her repressed feelings. He gives her a card to go to the local acupuncture, and you can tell that, look, she doesn't really feel super strongly about it, but she kind of knows she has to do something about it because it's affecting her health at this point. So referencing again the whole Zuko stuff we're going to talk about in the Avatar episode, like, she's going through that same sort of thing, that, like, her feelings are affecting her kind of the energy pathways of her body, and she's struggling to walk around. It's affecting her health, it's affecting her bending, I guess. She needs to deal with this. So what are your thoughts on this opening Lin scene?
Yeah, no, this is, in sort of at least beginning to realize that there's something that she has to deal with. I think she's, even throughout this episode, we see that she's still pretty sort of, blasé, I guess, about sort of, what she's sort of feeling. But, I think, the physical sort of manifestations of what she's sort of dealing with, become too apparent to her to even sort of ignore, which is why she's, at least I guess you could say, willing, to sort of check things out to see what could be done. As long as she doesn't have to speak directly about things, they do make note of that in a couple seconds here. Yeah, it definitely feels like this is, the beginning of her tipping point, right?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, she does go to the acupuncturist. And so yeah, he says he's going to attempt to correct the imbalances in her chi. He kind of tells her, like, tell me when you kind of feel, like, the pressure. She doesn't feel anything, and he's like, oh, I'm going to have to get even more needles. So they kind of highlight how bad of a kind of energy blockage this actually is. And he just notes that, yeah, this can affect stuff like your memories, not wanting to talk about something can affect your energy, and until you deal with it, you're going to have this kind of blockage. So it's important to actually get through it kind of mentally. So this is what prompts the first flashback here. But I suppose pretty quickly, do you have any thoughts on the acupuncturist scene here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, he's an interesting character, and it's a way to sort of, I guess, balance out Lynn's sort of like super grumpiness and everything. But no, I like, at least the initial sort of idea of, what he can do to sort of, attempt to help her, and, sort of, just another way of seeing how, metal bending can be used directly in sort of like a health sort of manner here, which is, interesting to see.
So we go into the flashback here, and we see Lynn, who is an officer at this time, returns home to find a kind of teenage Su Yin hanging out with Terra Triad members, clearly looking at stuff they just stole. Lynn tries to stop her from basically ruining her life, but Su is like, hey, at least I have a life. And so the first scene just kind of gets across the idea of rebel Su, but the real presentation versus maybe the idealistic presentation that Su gave to maybe Korra with her backstory from the previous episode. That like, oh yeah, she's involved with a triad group here. This isn't very good. We when we go into the next part of the flashback, we see that Lynn is called out to chase down some robbers who are in a saddlemobile. She follows them, kind of takes them down, and who gets out of the driver's seat of the getaway car? It's Su. So she is basically she has to arrest Su and her friends who she just encountered, and this is what causes her to kind of wake up. She sends the needles flying out of her body with metal bending, and you can tell that she's struggling. And kind of like Aang walking away at the end of the Guru, she leaves, and the acupuncturist gives her the kind of advice that like, hey, if you leave without completing the process, you're going to be like even more sick about this. So she leaves, not wanting to handle it now that she's approaching what the actual issue is. But what are your thoughts on the flashback up to this kind of like midway point?
I like this flashback. I think this is really cool. It's another one of those cases where you can show what happened and it comes across really clear. So it's definitely cool to get to see our characters in sort of, their younger ages and see how they develop, and, just Republic City in general, just sort of, seeing how it looked back then, technology and the level that it was at that point in time. I think it's really cool to get to see sort of, era specific of that, sort of timing there. So no, I thought that was really cool to get the idea of, just sort of how things function back there. And yeah, just sort of the issues that the sisters are having, it definitely comes across very sort of strongly, sort of their back and forth with each other, and sort of what point they're at in their lives, and Suyun being sort of the rebellious sort of teenager mode. So yeah, it's definitely really cool to see.
We get a quick scene where Lynn initially goes back to where she's staying, and it seems like young Su Yin comes in to check on her, but it's actually Lynn hallucinating Korra as younger Su Yin. So she realizes that, like, okay, the guy was right. I actually have some real problems here. She, like, again, super heavily sweating. She's like hunched over. She barely makes it back to the acupuncturist and is like, what did you do to me? She gets straight back onto the table, and we go back into it here with the addressing these repressed memories, of course. Interesting to kind of go that far with it. Kind of like, I suppose, Zuko's kind of hallucination stuff, like we talked about in the last Avatar episode, that she does go through something kind of quite similar here with the blocked energy kind of halfway through the process. But any thoughts on this quick kind of intermission in the flashback?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think hers definitely feels, very serious in terms of like, this was really a strong sort of like interruption of the process. Cause, Aang, after his, which we'll discuss later on, like he's at least able to function, after his sort of, leaving of sort of the process that he was starting here. But Lynn is really like, she can't do anything with this, and she's hallucinating and everything. So this is like a really sort of like strong process, which, just speaks to, I guess, sort of, how repressed this issue is, that she's, even more sort of messed up, not finishing this process.
So we go back into the flashback. Lynn confronts Sue about, what's happening. It's right on the street in the middle of everything happening. Sue tries to explain away that, hey, I was just the getaway driver. I didn't actually do anything. I was just helping them out. I owed them something. But Lynn cannot let her working with a gang kind of slide because she's a police officer. She has to arrest her here. So Sue goes to leave. Lynn grabs her with her metal wire kind of spool. Sue turns her kind of gauntlet into a kind of sword and cuts the wire, but the tension causes it to snap back, and this is where Lynn gets her kind of trademark scar on her face from. It's her trying to arrest her sister, and her sister basically resisting arrest is what injures Lynn in this. It's actually a huge moment in that, like, you almost, or like, apart from maybe some of the initial scenes with Lynn, maybe you forget that, like, oh yeah, the scar, like, where did she actually get that from? And so it's fascinating to see that it actually came from a member of her own family, and that you can see Sue when she does it, like, she's, oh, I'm just trying to get away, but then when she hurts her sister, you can tell that I didn't want it to go this far. That she is aware that she is in big trouble because she's technically, she's resisted arrest now. She's in even bigger trouble, and she's hurt her sister. So it's a really powerful moment, and I think a really cool answer to the question of the scar. But what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, it's always, something of note where a character has like a strong sort of physical appearance, and you sort of, always make note of it. So the fact that they were able to sort of incorporate that into their backstory, which, we don't know how far back they thought of this as, part of Lynn's sort of character, but it integrates really well. And then I think, they show it really well, and, you definitely get the impact of the moment there. I think is done, extremely well, which I think is, something that you always sort of look for in these sort of flashback moments, because, they could be almost anything, but usually the flashbacks really have, strong meanings to our characters, right? So I think that this was, the perfect way of actually using this and sort of showing us, how this has led up to everything, that they're sort of feeling right now. Because, sometimes you could see, maybe Lynn's sort of, being a little bit too, or sort of judgment of things, but no, you can see that this, at least in this case, it was a very sort of, impactful thing for her whole life going forward, and she always has like a visual sort of reminder of this incident with her family.
We then cut to the two girls in front of Toph. So we get some scenes with Toph here. She scolds both of her daughters, like, I can't believe you did this, but also to Lynn, I can't believe you did this as well. And this is like the core of why Lynn has a problem here. Like, why is Lynn in trouble for this situation, given that Sue's the one who kind of caused the issue? Like, why am I at fault for arresting someone who committed a crime? And it's this idea that Toph uses her position to kind of get Sue out of trouble here, because it would reflect poorly on Toph and her position to have a daughter go to jail over something like this. So Toph is going to have to basically cover this up. What happens here, the consequences for Sue, is that Sue is going to be sent away from the city to live with her grandparents. So she's going to stay with Lau and Poppy, I guess, and she'll just be sent away. She then tears up Lynn's arrest report for Sue and the gang members. This, of course, stuns Lynn, because, like, why does Sue effectively have, like, no consequences here? That, in a way, like, who's going to get in more trouble for this? It feels almost like, yeah, Toph and Lynn are maybe in more trouble because of how this arrest report's going to get handled over anything else. And this is the core of why this is a big issue, is that Lynn feels Sue got away with this, and maybe got away with a lot of stuff in their childhood, and Toph always just defended her. We'll get the other angle on this when Lynn speaks about it in a moment, but just as presented in the flashback, there it is. But what are your thoughts on this? Toph enters the flashback here.
Yeah, well, I mean, getting to see Toph, I think is, that's cool, just to get to see her older form and her personality and her character and sort of how she's dealing with this situation here. So definitely, it's something that we see her as sort of like her younger self. This isn't, necessarily something that many of us sort of picture her as sort of like a character role and stuff like that. So that's cool to get to see here. But yeah, the whole situation is very sort of like hard and tense, and you really don't know how it's going to go. And even when you do sort of get the full sort of story about it, you definitely can see, at least in this case, why Lynn might be sort of extra upset about the whole situation going here, because it really does feel like Sue Lynn just sort of gets away with it without too much sort of repercussions. I mean, yeah, she just have to leave the city and everything that she's built up here, but in terms of like the harsher sort of consequence that typically would happen to someone in this case here, feels like she sort of gets away with it. So I think it definitely sort of puts you on the side of Lynn here, at least initially, in terms of who's sort of at fault and who's at blame here, and who's doing better because of it.
Mm. And then there's also like the interesting aspect of like the scar isn't really addressed in all of this. Like Toph makes no mention of the fact that like Sue led to Lynn being injured, and like that might be a factor in it as well. They don't really bring that up, but it's interesting. So yeah, we come out of the flashback, and Lynn immediately gets up off the table and kind of knows what she has to do. She's going to confront Sue. So this is very directly confronting these repressed memories, but she is still physically dealing with this, just because even though I guess she's allowed things to flow, she's just allowed them to flow. So she's still kind of struggling a little bit here. And of course, she does arrive interrupting Bolin's kind of first metal bending lesson. But yeah, we get into the conversation here. Lynn says that Sue should have taken responsibility that day, and that their mom threw her career away over that incident. Sue says that no, she retired the next year, she was a hero. But Lynn says that, do you think she wanted to retire? She was so guilt-ridden over what she had to do that she didn't feel worthy of the position. That's why she retired like so quickly after the event. So that adds a bit more kind of context onto things in terms of like in a way, Toph, in terms of what she told Sue about this, further kind of eased Sue's kind of issues over the incident, when the reality of it is that no, kind of Toph's career actually was affected by the decision that she made that day, and Sue is now kind of realizing that in the present, as we'll kind of like roughly get to by the end of the episode. But what are your thoughts on this kind of opening part of the confrontation between the sisters?
Yeah, this definitely feels like the beginning of something larger that's going to escalate. But I think the fact that they're even sort of talking about it is at least a good step, at least in terms of Lynn's mind, because she's, I don't know, she's really reluctant to talk about anything that has to deal with sort of like her feelings or her emotions or anything like that. So this is, I don't know, I like that at least they're able to sort of confront this, but it does feel like it's very sort of Lynn way of doing things. Like she's just sort of coming up and sort of making sort of accusations and sort of just sort of coming straight out with it, which I think I guess works with her personality, right? That's what she would do.
Mm-hmm. Sue then admits that she's made mistakes in the past, but that she and Toph talked and worked things out years ago, and Lynn could have joined them in those kind of discussions, but didn't. And if Lynn had joined them, then she would realize that Sue is a very different person now from who she was in the past. Lynn still thinks underneath it all that she is still the same person. Sue fires back that Lynn is very clearly still the same person, a bitter loner who only cares about herself. And what starts the two sisters to fight is that she adds this little bit in at the end where she says, no wonder Tenzin ended things with you kind of years ago. And Lynn immediately throws a rock at her, basically starting the fight here. So this is properly getting into like what we maybe expected kind of to happen here. And it's the kind of classic idea of like, Lynn is the one who is still kind of stuck in the past because she hasn't addressed it in 30 years. Sue has, mostly on her own moved past this, so much so that she almost doesn't take any responsibility for the past because I've already talked about it and moved on from it. But she hasn't addressed things with Lynn. And so, yeah, that's what's happening here. The final issues kind of really being addressed here. And yeah, the shots that they kind of each take at each other, especially the Tenzin moment, is kind of interesting, but also very cutting. But what are your thoughts on what leads to the fight beginning?
Yeah, it is very sort of cutting, and I don't know. I think they're both sort of at fault here because yeah, Lynn has been sort of holding this in for the last 30 years or whatever, but Su Yen has in her mind she's sort of moved past it so much that she's not even willing to consider that there's still some things that she has to deal with because yeah, she's talked about it with Toph and stuff like that, which we learn I guess a little bit more about that directly, but Su Lin's Lin still doesn't understand the full idea of how that sort of changed Su Lin over these years here. So there's a lot of back and forth there that's sort of not cleared out yet, and I guess it takes them starting this fight to really sort of push past things.
So we get a full-on fight scene here as the sisters kind of go at each other. There's a clear kind of contrast in styles here, even though there's a similar foundation, of course, to both of them, given where they kind of learned their skills from. But you can clearly see that Lin is maybe a little bit more of a kind of typical brute force style earthbender using earth and metal, whereas Su Yin has more of a refined style that's a little bit more kind of flowing overall, and she tends to use metal, whereas Lin seems to use earth a little bit more. So there's some interesting differences between the two sisters in the way they fight. Sue also maybe has an environment advantage, just knowing where all the metal is in the environment, because it's the metal clan, so they have chunks of metal everywhere. So there's sheets kind of coming up, getting wrapped around everyone, bits of like stairs, kind of steps getting kind of dragged up out of the ground and thrown at each other. What brings the fight to an end is that the two of them are about to kind of slam giant rocks into each other when Opal steps in between the two of them and airbends their rocks out of the way, kind of screaming at the two of them to like, why are you fighting? Your sisters? Are you actually trying to hurt each other? And she does actually get through to both of them as they kind of realize that the fight was maybe going into a little bit too intense territory, because I think you had Bolin commenting earlier on in the fight that like, oh yeah, Korra, don't get involved in this. You don't have siblings. This is normal. But obviously, I'm guessing even for Bolin, it was beginning to get a little bit heated right as Opal interfered. But what are your thoughts on the fight here, the contrast of styles between the sisters, and then Opal interfering?
Yeah, you definitely can see that their use of the environment and how well they can use it, or just their idea of how they use it in a fight is definitely different from their sort of background and how they've developed their way of using earthbending in general. And I don't know, it feels like maybe Lynn is since she's not used to, or maybe because she's typically, not sort of trying to like, destroy the whole city that she's working in, and usually works with, the wires that she would typically have on her, right? But in this case, she doesn't have, any of that stuff with her, or at least not on her person. Like she doesn't have her typical, metal bending sort of gear on her. She's really sort of, pulling up things from sort of, what she can visually see pretty clearly in front of her. She doesn't even seem to be manipulating the metal in the area sort of as much, just more as sort of like a reaction to what Su Lin is actually sort of doing here, versus Su's just sort of, pulling up everything, using it to wrap things around. I mean, the environment that they're in is a training grounds, right? So, it kind of makes sense that they would have all of this sort of metal around, even though she does use, her son's sort of sculpture as well. There's different bits like that here. So yeah, there definitely is sort of, different ways that they're using it. And I guess it makes sense, Suyeon being part of the Metal Clan, and that's sort of like her whole thing, that would be something that she's really sort of focused on and manipulating. And when we do see other members of the Metal Clan and how they use metal as well, it kind of makes sense that they sort of would use it in this particular way. And that's just their focus and where they can use their abilities here. So it's definitely cool to see. It makes you wonder, if Lin was sort of at 100% peak, who would really win in this sort of situation here? I don't know. They're both, super skilled in their abilities, learning from Toph, why wouldn't it be, almost as good or as skilled? So yeah, there's a lot there. And even in, Lin's weakened state here is still a really good match.
Yeah, like I think this has always been a pretty interesting discussion. Is like, yeah, who would you rate higher as a bender between Lin and Sue? It's always been an interesting one because I think Lynn is the kind of preferred character just because we know her better, but there's maybe a tendency to like. It seems like maybe the skill level is maybe a bit more there with Sue, just because I think people obviously rate Kuvira better than both of them, and Sue's style matches up more with Kuvira than Lynn's does, and maybe that's a weakness of the kind of Republic City Police Force style overall, with the focus on the wires and maybe not as much of the focus on using all aspects of like metal armor and all this sort of stuff. But it's an interesting one because maybe Sue's focus on metal means she's maybe not as good with just Earth, whereas if it was just straight up Earth, maybe Lynn is the better kind of combatant. And it's very interesting. It's kind of hard to tell, but they're obviously meant to be relatively close together. I suppose, do you have a preference between the two? Who would you rate better between Lynn and Sue?
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, I think, no, Lynn is like, the fan favorite character, so I typically would think about her in that sort of case there. But I don't know. I almost feel like Lynn is too restricted in sort of her typical way of using earthbending, that she wouldn't be particularly sort of as creative as Xu Yin would be in her way of manipulating things. Despite maybe saying that Lin might be, the stronger earthbender, power level wise, air quotation marks, however you want to sort of consider that. I think in this case here, the creativity, in using your elements and stuff, that might be the way that Sue would actually overpower Lin in most situations. If everything else was considered sort of equal in the situation here, despite everything else. So I know that's definitely a good one to sort of consider. The tier list of our earthbenders and sort of what they can do and stuff like that. And how specialized their skills are. Like we still consider Toph being, sort of the best, even at such a advanced age when we do see her later on. But it's always fun to think about.
Mm-hmm. So, the other thing I think I forgot to mention in the previous scene, right after Opal interferes in the fight, Lynn collapses, kind of highlighting that she was on this wave of emotion, and the second they paused, she just collapses to the ground. So then we get to the next scene, and Lynn wakes up, and we're going to see this again in the Avatar episode with Zuko, but like, she has the exact same thing of just like waking up, and it's like cheerful Lin Beifong, like, who is this person? Really much more relaxed. She goes in, gets one of the fancy drinks from the pirate chef that Sue has, and is talking to him, and basically she then sees Opal walk past her room. She asks Opal to come inside to talk. She apologizes for the scene from the last episode where she kind of shouted at her. Opal understands kind of how difficult things must have been for Lynn, but Lynn kind of says that, like, I can see how skilled you are as an airbender, like, you have a lot of potential. I think it would be in your best interest to go and train at the air temple, like, with Tenzin. Opal reveals that she doesn't want to upset Sue by saying that she actually wants to kind of leave, and this is where we get the kind of resolution to things. Lynn says that she did kind of what she did in her life to try and please her mother, following in her footsteps as the chief of police, and in her mind it ultimately maybe didn't work out so well. She maybe didn't get the responses she wanted from her mother. We saw how the scene before kind of played out. Like, Lynn didn't really get any credit for kind of doing the right thing. So she says, Opal, you need to do kind of what I didn't do, and that is to do what's best for you, not what's best for your mother. And so Opal and Lynn hug. Opal then goes off to speak to her parents. This scene kind of happens off screen, but there's been so much setup towards this. We know kind of what's going to happen, and that sets up the Lynn and Sue talk, which we'll get to in a moment. But what are your thoughts on Lynn and Opal finally having the conversation we thought they were maybe going to have in the previous episode?
Yeah, I think this was, another sort of good down-to-earth sort of, talk here that they have about sort of their past and their futures, and where things can end up. And I like that Lynn's able to sort of give this sort of older person wise advice about the situation and what's sort of going down here, and sort of doing what you really feel you want to do, and doing it for yourself and not anyone else, because that'll work out better for you personally in the long run here. So no, I like Lynn sort of being able to impart this sort of advice to Opal and sort of helping her sort of make the decision for her future going forward here. So no, I think this was a really nice sort of way to sort of keep things going for the future here. And feels a bit sort of odd with Lynn sort of being sort of this more sort of down to earth sort of nice character here, but after everything that she's sort of gone through here, I don't know, it's a cool sort of change of pace for her character, even if she does sort of return to being sort of a bit more sort of grumpily later on. This is a nice sort of like reprieve from her personality and sort of her getting the time to rest about things going on.
And yeah, it's nice for Opal as well that like she gets the support from Bolin to kind of do this, but then she gets the kind of support from like a different side of things, like the person she's on really good terms with, and then also the person who was like just fighting with everyone is also saying the same thing. Like it's at this point it's like really obvious for Opal what she has to do, the decision that she has to make. And yeah, we get the resolution to that immediately next. Sue comes over to Lynn to talk. Sue reveals that, yeah, Opal came over. She was a little bit surprised that she actually kind of was as open as she was with them about it. But yeah, she's going to go train at the Northern Air Temple. Sue basically just understands. She wants her daughter to be happy. She talks... This is a reference to some lines that she had in the previous episode. She talks about how she was given so much freedom by Toph that she gave Opal too little freedom. So... now she's kind of trying to kind of counter that by letting Opal do what she wants. Sue then apologizes to Lynn, understanding that basically the sacrifice that Toph made by sending her away was what allowed her to kind of have the life that she has right now. And she truly realizes it at this point that that was such an important thing to happen in her life, and that she, in a way, maybe hadn't taken as much responsibility for what that kind of caused. She then says that she's heard from Mako that Lynn is an excellent chief of police, and that she knows that Toph would be proud of her. And so, yeah, we just end the scene with the idea that the sisters are on much better terms, but not so much that, like, Lynn is going to stay in Zaofu and kind of become part of the metal bending dance team with Sue and stuff like that. They're not there yet. That's not who Lynn is, but they are on better terms. And now really the only thing is that the setup for obviously next book is Lynn and Toph probably need to have a conversation as well. That's the last bit of setup with the family. What are your thoughts on the talk between the sisters here?
Yeah, this was really good. This was, really needed for them to sort of come to at least some understanding about their past and sort of how they've sort of changed, over the years here. I think, that was something that Lynn really didn't understand about Sue and sort of how she's changed and even how she's sort of, raised her family. Like the idea that, she was, more controlling than Toph ever was with them, just basically to balance out things. I think is a really, strong moment for her to sort of admit that to Lynn so that Lynn can sort of see that. I think that's a good way that they can come to just sort of understanding about, their past and Toph and sort of their upbringing. But yeah, I like that they're, in a better place at the end of this. And even if Lynn isn't going to be sort of the perfect sister that's going to live with them and everything like that, super big, okay family, they can at least be on good terms and, not have to fight each other every time they see each other.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that is the episode. Like I said at the start, I just really like the character focus that they leave the kind of bigger action for the kind of Red Lotus setup stuff in this episode, and they allow Korra, Opal, Bolin, Lin, Sue to just have a full-on character development episode with pretty good setup from the previous one. And, we still get to stay here for the next kind of episode or two to, now that we've done all the introduction stuff out of the way, we can have the plot happen here kind of going forward. So I think it's a really successful episode overall, that, again, I think it's my favorite from book 3. But I also say that as someone who a lot of the Red Lotus stuff I do have some issues with, kind of as we're going to get into, just because of kind of in a way part of the way the structure of this book goes, that we have to wait until well after the halfway point of the book to even get the basics on the Red Lotus, and then do they give us enough information given that it's a team of 4? We'll get into that as we go through kind of more of the kind of upcoming episodes. But we'll switch over to Avatar, and we're getting towards the end of book 2 here. We have 219, The Guru, we're going to talk about just now. So yeah, second last episode of the book. Again, I think this is one of my favorite book 2 episodes. It's pretty high up on my kind of episode ranking list. I really like this episode. Aang's my favorite character, so I really like the full character breakdown kind of examination we get through the chakras with Guru Patik. But I also like that we cover a lot of different plot threads because the group is split up. We have interesting stuff happening with everyone. Plus there's a Zuko plot. Plus there's an Azula plot. There's a Long Feng plot. This is like everything is going on at this point in time. And it's a very fast-paced episode because there are so many plots going on. But I think it's done really, really well to set up the big final episode. So this one actually gets a nice blend of, it's kind of chaotic, it's all over the place with how much happens, but it also has that central core of your main character gets super strong character development, with also a big choice heading into the finale, which I think is really good as well. But what are your thoughts on The Guru?
Yeah, you would think that, them being split up and there's so many different A, B, C, D sort of plot threads that it would be too much. But I think, they do just enough with each one while still focusing on Aang that it doesn't, feel like it's too much. Because, they're doing things, but there's, it's actually not really, that much time overall that passes, from when they split up to coming, sort of back together. So I think, doesn't feel like it's too, awkward that they're apart from each other or anything like that. So I think that helps a lot in the story. But yeah, I think, being able to focus on a little bit of each of the characters here and their sort of backstories, or at least, what they're up to, I think works really well. And since it's still, it's still all part of the bigger plot, I think that really keeps it, very sort of cohesive. Like there's still a thing that they're all, sort of fighting for that is, the same thing in the end, even if they're doing it on their own in separate places. So I would like that and enjoy how that sort of leads into the next part of these, set of episodes.
Mm-hmm. So because there's so many plot threads, I'm just going to kind of go through this in order of the scenes because it's very difficult to group up stuff apart from the chakras for Aang. So we'll start with Zuko, who has his Lin Beifong like awakening here, where he wakes up, smile on his face, happy to eat Iroh's kind of the food that he has made. He's actually, for the first time, invested in their new Earth Kingdom lives, invested in the Jasmine Dragon tea shop, happy, positive, 100% for Iroh. He's going to be involved in it. And Iroh initially is kind of like, oh, this is I expected a change, like beautiful metamorphosis, but this is a lot. But he is happy that Zuko is happy for him on his big day, opening up his own tea shop, his dream, the Jasmine Dragon, of course. So yeah, this is a very interesting episode for Zuko, where it's like he's come out of his big kind of metamorphosis after making the right choice, and this is what a Zuko who I guess is willing to leave his big destiny behind him looks like. This is someone who actually could settle down in the Earth Kingdom if he doesn't come back into contact with like the key elements of his destiny again. So it's a very odd version of Zuko, but it's interesting that they actually show us this version of Zuko for even a little bit. But what are your thoughts on the opening scene here?
Yeah, we get a bit of happy Zuko here, and sort of, could be, it's almost just sort of like a huge what if story, temporarily of, him being positive for this situation. I think, it definitely feels like it's not, with everything we've seen with Zuko up until this point, it feels, a bit awkward, as, Iroh makes note of as well. But, it wouldn't be too crazy if, his character was always like this. But, I think you can sort of tell that this is only sort of until something happens that sort of, forces him along the path that he originally thought he was going to be on. He's not, he's not that changed yet, but at least he's here, for Iroh in this day and is willing to support him in this instance here, and everything hopefully goes well.
Next scene is kind of quick. It's Aang drops Sokka off at the Southern Water Tribe kind of camp where Hakoda and the men are. Sokka's very nervous about meeting his father again, while Aang is actually really laser focused on, like, I'm going to learn the Avatar state. So yeah, Aang leaves as Sokka gets his big reunion with his father, and also as he walks through the other men, he kind of gets the fun interaction as they kind of see him again for the first time. So very cool Sokka moment, and then the emotion of, like, yes, finally Sokka meets them again for the first time in so long. So really, really strong scene here, really good setup. And again, Katara kind of sacrificed her opportunity to be here as well, but it's so important for Sokka in particular to have this moment. But what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, no, it is a very important for Sokka. I think, that's in one of his, through lines for his whole character, right? It's just him sort of becoming a man, or, what he thinks a man should do, and him being, a warrior, and how that's affected him, and the responsibility that his father sort of left on him, sort of to protect the village and stuff like that. So I think, it was important for Sokka to have this moment here to see the other, warriors of the tribe and what they're sort of doing, and sort of be, reaccepted into their group as, a full, sort of man and warrior of the group. I think that's something for him and his character. He needed that for his sort of, like, his confidence and stuff like that. Like, while Aang is sort of, willing and ready, or at least he thinks he's ready to sort of deal with his destiny after everything that he's done so far, Sokka's still, questioning a lot of that. So I think this was a great way to sort of begin to show that sort of development for Sokka, and for him to understand, the changes himself. Because even now in the beginning here, he's still not 100% on that.
Next scene is King Kuei meets with the quote-unquote Kyoshi warriors. Actually, it's Azula, Mei, and Ty Lee. And he just straight up, the significance of this scene is that he just casually mentions to them the invasion of the Fire Nation that they're planning, that it's going to be during an eclipse, and you get Azula's reaction to finding out these two things, I guess. This is, I'm assuming, her first time finding out that there's an invasion plan, but also that the eclipse is a vulnerable day for the Fire Nation that's coming up. She now has that key information, and obviously the plan is now in danger if Azula gets this information back to the Fire Nation. That's the point of this scene. Even if Azula's infiltration only goes this far, the information, the secret plan that they had is now, ruined, basically. But this is the skill of Azula, and this isn't even everything she's planning to do. So really successful scene here. I love the cut to Azula's eyes as Kuei just casually reveals this important info. But what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah. I mean, Sokka said, they're trustworthy, right? So, it would make sense that he would tell them this sort of in sort of a offhanded way, because of course they would be against the Fire Nation as well, being, Kyoshi warriors and everything like that. So, I guess you could sort of see the reason why King Kuei would say this, even though this does feel like maybe a bit of something that you would keep a little bit under wraps. But again, King Kuei, for the most part, has been just sort of the figurehead type king. So maybe he's not sort of, on the up and up in terms of, security of, armed forces and stuff like that. So I don't know, maybe that's just sort of a fault of his character, or just a lucky situation that Azula and her group are sort of happen to be in here. But yeah, she's definitely already figured out, or developing plans on how to sort of, use this to her advantage in this moment.
Mm-hmm. There's a quick cutaway to Katara, who is, of course, with the kind of Council of Five, where they come up with the plan. The plan is now kind of finalized. So she's going to take it to the king for final approval, but is going to stop to get some tea along the way. That's the kind of setup for a little bit later on, but there's not maybe too much to talk about right now. Which moves us straight on to Aang arrives at the Eastern Air Temple and meets Guru Patik. So Patik reveals that he was a friend of the Air Nomad, but also a personal friend of Monk Gyatso. So there's the kind of line of dialogue that They never say that Patik is 150 years old, but this line of dialogue implies that basically, that just how old he actually is. So yeah, the whole point, Patik sums up how Aang's going to master the Avatar state as Aang needs to be balanced in himself to bring balance to the world, and that's how he's going to go about mastering the Avatar state. So yeah, some just quick scenes here of just kind of the introductions, kind of this is what Katara is doing while everyone else is away, and Aang has his introduction to Patik because of course Appa has already met him. So what are your thoughts on these quick two scenes?
Yeah, I mean, for Katara, it's cool to see that she's involved directly with this sort of planning, which is, what they've always wanted, right? Like they've been, trying and trying to sort of, show that they have this plan. This is, the best case to sort of, save the world, essentially, right? Or at least that's what they think at this time here. So, I like her involvement with that. The little, sort of fun moment with Momo is, it's a nice sort of touch here, despite the sort of, seriousness of the situation here. But, I like that they give some time to focus on that. And Aang meeting Guru Patik, he's, it feels like he's a little bit sort of hesitant in this situation of what's going on, but he's still, has in mind that this is what he needs to do, and he's willing to do this training, even if he has to eat this really sort of bad sort of juice.
Mm-hmm. Next, we have an update on what's happening with Toph. Of course, she's been captured by Xinfu and Master Yu. She tries to do some trickery here by being like, oh, I need to go to the toilet. Master Yu is about to go for it. Xinfu stops him. That sort of trickery is not going to work. And can she even break out? Because she's in a metal cell. And they maybe a little bit overdo it with the Xinfu line of like, even you can't bend metal. Like, it's very on the nose kind of, okay, she's about to bend metal. Especially if you've watched any like people watching the show for the first time. Like, I think everyone kind of calls metal bending here. It's just maybe a little bit over foreshadowed here, but still, it's a cool setup for, it gets her thinking about, oh, can I do anything here? Like, you don't really get Toph's thought process like too much, but she maybe gets to thinking about what metal is, and we'll see what happens in the next Toph scene. But what are your thoughts here on our quick Toph up?
I mean, I wonder, I can't even remember that far back what I really thought, if I thought it was going to be sort of metal bending at the time. I don't know. I feel like back then it might have been a harder thing to place that, she was going to do this, but, the fact that they say metal and bend, that kind of sort of implies it by default, even if it doesn't seem super obvious. But no, I like this. It's a short scene and just shows you where things are going to go. And just seeing the two sort of interact with each other, how one is sort of, I guess you could say like the more sort of traditionalist in earthbending, he's like willing to sort of maybe let her out of there, which, seems like a mistake. But Xinfu, he's sort of already in the underground sort of shady sort of dealings there. So, of course, he's not going to fall for anything, or at least not initially.
Yeah, it is an interesting point because, like, we're still early enough in the series and the franchise where, like, the concept of, like, special techniques is like, okay, we've seen lightning. We've had, like, we've seen lava bending, but, like, we don't really know what exactly it is as such because it's mostly been done by, like, it's only been done by avatars. So, like, the concept of, like, oh, does every technique have a special, like, advanced form necessarily? Like, we've seen healing, but it's before, like, blood bending's been introduced. It's an interesting one in terms of, like, yeah, like, going back to, like, 2007 of, like, was the concept of this sort of stuff on our minds? It's hard to remember. But, next, Azula plans a coup. She's going to use the Dai Li. She's figured it all out, that to take Ba Sing Se from the inside, which is what she wants to do, she knows that she has to be in control of the Dai Li because they're the most important factor in the city more than anything else. And she commits to just the idea. We're on the inside. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to take Ba Sing Se. Ty Lee admires Azula's confidence that she just sets out to do this straight away, and so far it seems like it's going well for her. But I do like the focus on the Dai Li because we've already set up the idea of, well, Quay feels they're on his side because they're meant to be loyal to him, but they're actually loyal to Long Feng. And now Azula is targeting the Dai Li. it's cool to see a group of benders be placed in this position where like they're the real power in like the biggest city in the world. But what are your thoughts on this Azula scene?
Yeah, I like her sort of, plotting things through. I think those are really sort of the strength of what she can do as a character, despite all of her sort of, crazy bending abilities and lightning bending stuff like that. But her plotting and sort of being devious behind the scenes is what, really makes her scary because she can just sort of, think of ideas and then follow through with them and be successful with them. I think, Zuko has, similar abilities and skills and stuff like that, but he has, some blockers in sort of ways that he actually gets things done or he goes through them, too directly or anything like that. Like Azula will manipulate the situation to her sort of best advantage here, and her planning this, really shows the strength of that from her character.
I think at this point we cut back to Guru Patik and Aang. Well, I'm going to save the whole chakra sequence until right at the end. So we'll cut to a lot of the other scenes first. So we have Hakoda prepares the men for battle as they get a signal that like they need to get prepared. And the main significance of this scene is just that Sokka is like, does that include me? He said the men for battle. Am I a man? But Hakoda really kind of cleverly kind of answers this question without like it kind of highlighting that maybe he's giving him maybe special treatment. He's just like, you heard me, I said all the men get ready for battle. And he just goes off really happy that he's considered one of the group. So nice scene from Hakoda here, and Sokka kind of gets the big moment that he kind of wanted here, even though it's this relatively kind of subtle moment in the middle of the scene kind of type thing. So really kind of nice stuff there. But any thoughts on this quick Hakoda scene?
Yeah, no, I think this is good because I mean, if you can remember back to the beginning and there's sort of initial idea of Sokka being sort of left behind, I think this is a really nice sort of contrast to that with him actually sort of being included in sort of the men and sort of going off to battle here, even if it is small scale thing. And I think it works really well, and just sort of showing sort of how well they sort of work together as father and son. That whole idea with the sort of invention that Hakoda made, I think that just goes back to them sort of being very similar to each other in their thinking and their ideas and stuff like that. So no, I thought this was a really nice sort of short scene here between the two of them.
Mm-hmm. Then we get a scene where Iroh finally opens the Jasmine Dragon. So he's achieved this great dream in his life to have his own tea shop. And the big thing here is that Zuko is happy for Iroh. Iroh's happy himself, but he's especially happy because Zuko is kind of with him and supporting him on this special day. Whereas before, Zuko had always been like, oh, well, this is your dream. Like, this is not really my destiny. Everything's going right for you, and I'm kind of going along with you, but like it doesn't really involve me. But here he's actually just really happy to be there with Iroh on this day, as like it is a big moment for Iroh to have his own tea shop, and in a way, for it to be in Ba Sing Se, it's like there's something symbolic about that, given what happened to like Liu Ten and so on. So it's an interesting moment as like they're going about their business like unaware of a lot of the other stuff happening, but like it's about to kind of fall apart, as we'll see in a few scenes time. But what are your thoughts on this scene, the opening of the Jasmine Dragon?
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I mean, that's sort of we've known that to be sort of Iroh's sort of a dream goal here, and to actually see Zuko enjoying the moment, reveling in it, I think is really it's really something that you wouldn't necessarily expect. It's just sort of nice that Zuko just sort of had this sort of turn of mentality right as this is being sort of opened here. So no, it's cool. It looks interesting. I really like sort of the light of it, and we get to see more of it going on in the future there, even if it is about to sort of fall apart, at least for a little bit here.
Mm-hmm. Next, we have the scene that kind of starts out with May and Ty Lee just like openly talking out in front of people. They know that Ty Lee are listening. It's an Azula plan, but they openly talk about being Fire Nation and hush, you'll tell the whole city. The Ty Lee are going to report back to Long Feng on this, and then Azula walks out and reveals that this is exactly what she wanted. This is how she's going to get involved in things in terms of like, yeah, how do we get the how do we get involved with the secret organization? We reveal secrets out in the open and they'll eventually find us. That's kind of her tactic so far, though we don't know the full scope of her plan just yet, but she wanted to out herself, knowing kind of an idea about what's happening in the city. So interesting, bit of a risky play here for Azula, but she obviously calls it quite well before she's even met Long Fang. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's risky in a way, but I don't know. I feel like Azula probably already has sort of the measure of things and even to sort of set things up. So I don't know, but I like the situation. I think it's cool to get, sort of, Ty Lee and Mai to sort of, play along with this, thinking that, there's really sort of a way that they would let this slip out there, which I don't know. It would have been funny if they sort of, found out when they were in sort of the rooms before. You would have thought that that's where they would have spied on them, but maybe they just sort of, the Ty Lee wasn't ready to sort of spy on them in that sort of moment here. But no, it's a great setup.
Mm-hmm. Next, Katara heads into the Jasmine Dragon and spots Zuko and Iroh, and then immediately rushes out to inform the king. So they don't notice her, she's just noticed them. And we just get this situation where a kind of panicked Katara has suddenly encountered former enemies, and when she goes back, she's confronted by Azula and co, who immediately kind of out themselves, and the king obviously isn't quite there. And what happens here is that this is an interesting point where, of course, this is how Katara gets captured, but it's also how Azula finds out that Zuko's in the city. So a few things kind of come into play with this scene, that Katara brings Azula inadvertently key information that she wants, and the idea is that Azula is actually planning to go visit Zuko. So Zuko's happy moment is going to be kind of cut short because all of a sudden, I suppose, the dream, the metamorphosis moment, the two dragons on each shoulder is actually going to be real life in the next episode. So what are your thoughts on this Katara and Azula scene?
Yeah, it's too bad for Katara here. I mean, everything was sort of looking up, and they have sort of the plans that Azula knows about but doesn't know anything specific. So it's like, all this sort of just sort of falls into Azula's hand, and Katara is just sort of left on sort of the wayside here. I mean, I guess it would be quite surprising to see sort of like the person that sort of chased you, like, probably all over the world at this point, just happens to be in the same city that you're at, although they weren't looking for you in this case here, but, still surprising, and that sort of sets her off on this way here to getting Katara captured. But yeah, it's definitely too bad for Katara and her sort of, everything that's going on, since everything we're looking up.
Mm-hmm. And then we get... this is in my notes. Yeah, this is where I have the whole sequence with the Guru Patik and the chakras. So, we'll go through this. So this is our introduction to the concept of chakras. I don't think we've ever heard this word mentioned before this episode, really. And so, he explains what chakras are, because Aang doesn't have a clue what they are either. There are 7 of them. They are pools of spiraling energy in the body, and Aang will have to open up all of these 7 chakra pools across different points in his body to be able to control the avatar state, because this is how the kind of energy system of the body works, but also it will get him into the right sort of mental state in how he will open these chakras to also be able to unlock the avatar state as well. This is the whole point from earlier on in the episode about how he will have to achieve kind of balance within himself to achieve the avatar state. That's the whole idea. As we'll get into here, each chakra has a purpose that it's kind of related to. It will then be blocked by a specific type of emotion, and it also has a specific location. And so he's going to have to go through all of these kind of one by one and open them. Very, very interesting setup for this overall, because it's actually getting somewhat technical into the way bending works, the way kind of the energy system of the body, like I said, works, and it's a really interesting thing that they don't really go into that often in like any other Avatar material. chakras get mentioned every so often, like there's mentions of them in the Kyoshi novels, but never in particular detail. But it's interesting that they went in depth for this scene because it's important to get across the significance of the Avatar state. But yeah, what are your thoughts on our introduction to chakra?
Yeah, no, it is important. I think it really does, set the stage up for everything that Aang has to go through in order to release this sort of, power that he has within himself, but is sort of, hidden away at the current moment, or at least, the better control of it is sort of hidden away here. So I like that, they're giving us, they're willing to give us this sort of set of details. It feels like, I think when they have, instances when they're able to sort of really, define things, no, it makes things feel a little bit more sort of believable. I mean, it's all sort of fantasy and fiction and sort of made up, but it gives it some sort of, ground in this universe that makes it feel all the more sort of real, that there's, things that he can do to sort of overcome, what he has, had happened to him in the past here, and that will, lead him to being able to control the Avatar state. So no, I like this sort of intro here. Maybe something that it would have been cool if we got more of it later on with different characters, if there was a way to sort of, incorporate it, into their sort of, issues and turmoils that they're going through themselves. But no, I think, for what we're seeing here, it works.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening here. Like visually, it's the idea that they gradually make their way up the sort of mountain in the same way that we gradually go up from the lowest point in the body to the like top of the body, basically, as we go up the chakras. So there's some interesting kind of symbolic kind of stuff there as we're kind of ascending to effectively the cosmos by the last one. So the first one here is the Earth Chakra, base of the spine, deals with survival blocked by fear. So how this works is that basically Aang meditates on what is holding him back from like achieving the chakra. So in this case, all these fears that he has is keeping him from unlocking the kind of power of survival effectively. And so a lot of this is just the moments when he's been frightened over the course of the series, but lingering, especially towards the end, on the kind of faceless enemy that is Fire Lord Ozai at some point in the future. And the guru just guides him through the idea of like letting your fears go. And it's obviously a tough thing to kind of get across, I think, in almost any medium, especially with no maybe internal dialogue going on here, but just the idea that this is a tough thing to do. He technically just kind of thinks about his memories, meditates a bit, and he gets over it. But they do a good job here with like the sound effects of kind of highlighting that no, this was actually this tough mental thing, in the same way that was presented with like Lin going through acupuncture. It's a kind of similar thing here as well. And I think we also maybe have to discuss at this point, because I think some people maybe misinterpret this sometimes, that it's like coming out of this, like Aang unlocks the Earth Chakra here, which is blocked by fear. It doesn't mean he never is frightened anymore. Because I think a lot of people take some of this stuff like super, like literally, like let go of all your fears, like you can never be frightened again. It's mostly just the idea of not being controlled by these things that can potentially hold you back. And so that's the kind of significance here, is like acknowledging your fears and being aware that you can move past them, that they're not insurmountable objects, but that's the significance here. So what are your thoughts here on the Earth Chakra and just the way that they approach doing this kind of as we go through them?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the way that they go about showing this. I mean, I think for the most part they get across that these, are not sort of like, things that are like completely insurmountable to sort of overcome, but they do take some work. He does have to work at it. He does have to let things go. You can see him sort of like, even while thinking about, just sort of the elements, that he sort of has a physical reaction to them, right? Like he's, sort of almost like knocks him out of sort of the sort of meditative initial trance that he's in, each of these sort of moments here, but he's able to sort of overcome them. I think he's able to sort of, come to an understanding of things. I think that's sort of the key idea here. Like he's not, sort of pushing things away that he's never going to sort of feel them, like you're saying there, but he's able to sort of, confront them sort of directly in a manner which, otherwise he might not have, right? And again, he is sort of a very young character, so him sort of coming to terms with any of these things, I think, is a really sort of huge part of his character and a huge part of his sort of development. I think, when they go through these moments, we get to see sort of the flashbacks of these sort of incidents that sort of held him back before, and they do a good job of sort of like, tinting them and sort of, showing that these are really sort of, huge moments in his, young life at this point in time.
Hmm. The second chakra is the water chakra. In the episode, they don't say the location, but it's the sacrum. Deals with pleasure blocked by guilt. So Aang, of course, is guilty. He blames himself for running away, being the reluctant avatar, for hurting people in previous times using the avatar state, kind of uncontrolled. And Guru just points out that he has to accept that these things have happened and that he has to forgive himself for these things. His guilt cannot cloud his energies to accomplish what he has to do. So he lets this kind of go, accepting that, like, he doesn't have to hold on to all guilt for all time. He can focus on other things as well. He can have, it's the pleasure chakra, basically. He's allowed to have those moments regardless of like other stuff that's happened. So an interesting one, because this is like a core part of his character as well. Like, he is the reluctant avatar. Accepting the position to a certain degree is a big thing for him. But what are your thoughts on the water chakra?
Yeah, him accepting his position, which, he came into this whole sort of, seeing the guru that he would sort of accept this, right? But even having that in mind, there's still a bit of a, I guess you could say, like, build up to him really sort of accepting this, and considering, sort of the times before when he's sort of been, forced into it with General Fong and, even other states. This is a bit of a, I don't know, I guess you could say like a learning experience for him to really sort of understand that, he, even if he wasn't, necessarily wanting to be sort of in this and, ran away from it initially, he's come to the point, in his journey so far that he's actually willing to accept that this is the position that he has to be in, which I think is, something that he's now, just beginning to sort of really understand.
Mm-hmm. Third is the fire chakra, located in the stomach, deals with willpower blocked by shame. So Aang is ashamed of burning Katara from the deserter, and he reveals that because of this, he will never firebend again. And that's something he's ashamed of, just the firebending aspect of who he is. And the Guru's comment here is pretty good. It's just like, you have to accept that because you are the avatar, you are a firebender. That is a part of you, and you have to accept this, which Aang does. And the fire chakra opens, and they kind of note that, like, this one opens quite aggressively, I suppose, as well, because it was so closed off because of the kind of shame over burning Katara. So a very kind of thematic one, because it is the fire chakra, of course. But what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, it is very thematic. I don't know, I think that's really cool that sort of plays into sort of the firebending element of his sort of history and sort of his acceptance of that part of himself. I think, that was very sort of, I guess you could say, a traumatic sort of experience, him sort of burning Katara, especially with, what he eventually learns that she means to him. And by the end of this episode, that would be something that would really sort of upset him going forward in the future here. But yeah, he is a firebender and all of the other elements, because that's sort of who the avatar is, and that is a key element of his character and his sort of being here. So no, I think that's a key one for him to sort of get over. You almost see him sort of start to get over it before, when he was initially learning firebending, but he's sort of had a huge sort of block and jam to get in the way of that.
Mm-hmm. Next is the air chakra, located in the heart, deals with love blocked by grief. And so this is the kind of big one for Aang, as like the character out of time. In addition to the fact that the Air Noma genocide happened, he has lost basically everyone close to him, his entire people, and then everyone effectively except Bumi, who he knew from his era, is gone. And the Guru kind of guides him through this one, that the idea is that like the love is a form of energy. It is reborn in the form of new love, which is Katara. And this is a kind of particularly emotional one because Aang kind of cries as he opens this chakra here. And again, there's the thematic connection of the air chakra as he deals with the loss primarily of his people, the air nomads. So particularly kind of notable here. In addition to the fact that I suppose Katara is a recurring element in a lot of these as well. But what are your thoughts on the air chakra?
Yeah, I think that's a real key scene, the strength one where the one where you get to see sort of all of the the people from the Air Nomad Nation and them sort of lining up before. I think, him and his sort of character, that's always seemed to be, something that he's really been sort of keyed into. So the fact that he still has a connection with them and that, it's changed into a new connection with Katara in the present, I think is it's a real key thing for his character and it's really sort of like essential to his being. So no, I think that was a real strong one for him.
And especially because like in the grand scheme of things, like the series rarely brings up the loss of Aang's people to him. They don't really approach it that regularly in many scenes. Like to the point where like even when like say the Promise does this, when like he meets the fan clubs and they're invested in air nomad culture, and Aang has a kind of emotional moment at seeing that because he's so unused to it after all of this time. And Katara kind of has that moment where she's like, oh, I thought he was liking the female attention, when actually it was like, no, just the focus on anything about his culture, kind of that, to a certain degree a lot of the others don't talk to him about it all that much. And so this moment where it just gets tackled kind of head on is particularly important, and that like it kind of feels like I would have liked it to be covered somewhere else in the series to a certain degree, but we'll move on. I suppose because we did the first four there, the naming of all of them is quite interesting: earth, water, fire, air. The next three are not related to the elements, of course, but we'll maybe get into that in a second. We obviously have never really got any direct confirmation that like the naming of those first four chakras relates to anything. But then there's like the whole idea of, because it's a little bit technical, we know that for someone to have bending, they have the quote unquote power of the element in their body, which is a energy of some sort that can be given and taken away. From Line Turtles, Avatar power. And the idea is like, where's that energy stored? Is that a extra significance of the naming of specific chakras, given that they're pools of spiraling energy, that like if you're a water bender, your water chakra is particularly active, for the Avatar is all four active. It's an interesting kind of one to kind of highlight. They never really go into great detail about it overall, but that's just kind of something worth noting to a certain degree. Do you have any thoughts on that? Just the naming of like, here are elemental chakras up first.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That always made some sense to me that's how it would contribute into the sort of like benders of this world here, and that would be the way that they're able to sort of I guess manifest their sort of like abilities to some degree. I don't know, and they've never gone into detail of how much it is, but when you have ones that are like specifically like fire and willpower, and they've talked before how much that sort of goes into the idea of fire bending and stuff like that. It seems like it would make sense that things would be sort of interconnected in that sort of way, but again, I'm sure there's ways that multiple ones could be using different elements and stuff in certain key moments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's also interesting stuff where like the fire chakra is located in the stomach, but then we also know that the stomach is like the sea of chi in the body, which is, I don't think they're just referring to it as like another way to refer to the fire chakra, because in the core video game they also refer to like the Panchem Dantian, which is effectively the same thing, where you can like steal chi from people from. So like they're approaching these topics in kind of interesting ways, where we have like bits and pieces of like, how does bending like work on a technical level? We kind of know in terms of like, okay, all energy is kind of stored within the stomach, and then it's passed through the chakras before going along the chi paths, which you can then extend it out from that to use bending, and it's kind of interesting. Next up, the fifth chakra is the sound chakra, located in the throat. This deals with truth, is blocked by lies. And so this one, kind of similar to the water chakra to a certain degree, tackles a similar thing, but more of just the truth and lies about it. Is that, like, Aang never wanted to be the Avatar. He has to accept that he is the Avatar. And this is the one where they more directly kind of highlight that idea of he is the reluctant Avatar no more after this, because he truly does accept the position 100% at this point overall. So that's the truth of the matter, and the kind of biggest lie he's dealt with is just like almost not accepting that he actually is the Avatar because of the impact that had on his life when he was younger, when he was told, all that sort of stuff. But what are your thoughts on the sound chakra?
Yeah, this is cool. I mean, I think, for him and his sort of background and history, him being able to admit this to himself, that he was sort of hiding this before, again, it's another one of those moments where he's really sort of, coming into understanding of what it means to be the Avatar, or at least beginning to understand what it means. When they do this in front of the past Avatar statue, I think that really sort of, sets this up really well.
Mm-hmm. 6 is the light chakra, located in the forehead, deals with insight blocked by illusion. There's a whole sequence about this one because it relates to like Toph as well. The greatest illusion is the illusion of separation. Things you think are separate are actually one in the same. And they discuss the nations as being a big example of that, and the whole idea of like they are somewhat arbitrary kind of borders, when actually people are all people. The world is one type thing. Even the elements, like this is actually a quite interesting point here, because you almost get distracted by the transition into metal bending. But even the elements are one and the same, four parts of the same whole. Like, what does that mean? Even metal is just purified and refined earth. As we cut to Toph, sensing the metal, she finally is able to get through enough to sense that there is little bits of earth still in there. And she forces it and eventually is able to punch and eventually force her way through the metal bending for the first time ever in the history of the franchise, basically. So she frees herself and heads back to Ba Sing Se. It's kind of combining a couple of scenes together there, but that's a big scene there. I like the use of that it's not just an Aang exclusive thing, that, hey, here's a piece of advice that actually works for Toph's situation as well. So I thought that was quite well done. But what are your thoughts on the light chakra?
Yeah, I think, the whole idea of, the nations and sort of the people there, and sort of, how people view themselves as being different but not really different, I think is, that's something that's really something to keep in mind there. And I think that's a really good thing for Aang to sort of understand, at least, going forward. I think, airbenders in general have always been ones that are sort of, try to be sort of interconnected with people and stuff like that. So I think that might have been sort of maybe a bit of an easier one for him to get. But, the world at large, sees itself as very separate. So he needs to sort of understand that sort of distinction that other people have and be able to sort of, get past it. But yeah, and even, considering the elements there and integrating that in with Toph's sort of, discovery there, like you said, is a really good way to do it. It almost does distract you from, this topic here that is really important overall, and something that's going to sort of come into play just in terms of avatars and just sort of how they deal with people of the world, right? Because they're sort of, the mediator between the spirit world and the human world and just people in general. That's sort of their role in the world.
Mm-hmm. And then I suppose the idea as well with that, even the four elements, four parts of the same whole, is I suppose it's meant to be a bit of a energy bending reference prior to energy bending, or at least leading you in that direction, that, it's all bending. You're using, martial arts and a fundamental technique where you manipulate your own energy to manipulate elements. The only difference is sort of like the literal end result, what you're able to bend. But the Avatar can bend all of them, and it's like, just kind of creating that idea that, like, yeah, the the separation between them. There is one, but it's the fundamental same power, just used kind of slightly differently as an interesting kind of position to kind of take as well. Last one, 7. Thought chakra, located in the crown of the head, deals with cosmic energy, pure cosmic energy, and is blocked by earthly attachment. So what we get here straight away is just straight up earthly attachment, Katara. And it looks like it's going to go the same as the other ones, but as the guru guides him through this, he basically says, and now let go. Let the attachments kind of go away, forgotten. Aang kind of snaps out of it and is like, I love Katara, why would I want to let her go? And we actually have a discussion about this one where Aang kind of points out that, like, wait, a couple of chakras ago it was a good thing, love, the air chakra deals with that, like it's a part of it, and now I'm meant to let go of my attachments. What's going on here? And the guru's advice is you have to learn to let go. That's the kind of truth of it, ultimately. And it's an interesting one here because he focuses on this in particular because it's about Katara, it's about attachment. It's this, he's, I suppose, in his head maybe realized for the first time here that he does love Katara, and then he's asked to let go, learn to let go. He takes it in the most extreme way possible, as if, like, if I let go, I'm not allowed to kind of care about her anymore, when the guru is just kind of highlighting you need to learn to let go. And like all the other ones, it's not all or nothing. It's like, just because you unlock the earth chakra doesn't mean you don't have any fear anymore. Just doesn't mean you can't feel guilt or anything like that. You can't be ashamed of anything going forward. It's how you deal with those things going forward. And so the point of this chakra is more about not letting your attachments define you. It's the kind of it's the Anakin Skywalker thing, and it's actually kind of interesting in that, like, there's like a scene in episode 3 where, like, Yoda says something basically identical to what the guru says here, like learn to let go of everything you fear to lose. And it's the same kind of logic there. It's not like to an extreme of like, oh, just let go right now. It's no, prepare yourself if a situation arises where you have to make choices in that regard. So it's an interesting one, but obviously this is kind of classic, hero's journey type thing. He's not quite ready for it yet. He has to, as we'll go through it in a second, he has to go and save Katara before he kind of realizes the importance of, like, unlocking this technique type thing. But before we get to the attempt to unlock the chakra, what are your thoughts on the conversation that happens just surrounding what this one is about?
Yeah, I think, for Aang and his sort of character and his development up to this point, like he has a lot of earthly attachments, right? Like even if he is an air nomad and he grew up in that sort of culture, it almost makes you think that maybe because of the loss that he had of his whole nation, that any sort of current earthly attachments that he has are that much sort of stronger because of it, which you could understand. Like, that would be something that would really sort of affect you as a character. So I think that's a good point to make there about sort of his character and sort of him learning to let those go. Even though some of these are sort of like overlapping in the sense where before he had to learn that he still did have the love of the Air Nation. Even if they are no longer with you, he himself still has that, tether to them, or at least to, where they used to be, in his heart here, or in his mind. So I think this is a good sort of point for him and his character to sort of, really think about what that means, and to fully sort of, be able to, potentially sort of let them go and to, release this to the next step.
Mm. Yeah, and there's interesting things as well, like Yang Chen's advice in the finale of, like, that, like, the Avatar can never be, like, kind of truly free because they have to be attached, like, to the world. And it's like, oh, like, how does that work? Like, an earthly attachment to the earth itself kind of type thing. But, like, you are, to a certain extent, attached to everyone because of the position that you have. But again, it's kind of highlighting more of what we'll see in the next episode. Like, Aang literally presented with the opportunity of, like, do you go into the Avatar state, accepting that, like, something bad might happen to Katara, who's in a bit of danger? Or do you risk everything, like the entire world, to go and maybe attempt to save her, but you can't guarantee that it will actually work out super well? It's that idea. When it comes down to it, can you make the right choice as the Avatar, basically? And we actually see that happen in the next episode, basically. And that actually, you know, a lot of people kind of discuss, like, oh, did he ever really unlock this chakra in the end? But like he does in the next episode. Like we'll discuss it there, but he actually does open the chakra. It's just something happens after that, of course. So that's the interesting point here. Is that, yeah, this is Aang's kind of big flaw as a character. Like at the start of the series, I suppose it was more that he was the reluctant Avatar, that the issue maybe was more of the like water chakra, sound chakra, but like this far into the series, it is more of this thought chakra situation, attachments to the people, as you say, because he feels all the more about the people he is attached to now because of how much he's lost. So it's a good kind of major flaw for the character to have, because we've already seen him go through that with Appa, the other kind of big attachment that we kind of literally saw him go through everything with. And it's that idea of he nearly let that kind of destroy him, and that's the issue that he kind of needs to get over. He was able to get through that situation. Can he get through any potential issue with the Katara attachment, as we'll go to see? But yeah, he does actually try to unlock the chakra here, and we see it's actually working, and he's about to do it. Like, there's the only thing that stops him from unlocking the chakra here is that literally at the worst possible moment, he senses that Katara is in danger. And like, admittedly, you know, it's perfect. It's a perfect counter, I suppose, to like he's not ready to unlock the chakra, because he makes the choice to, you know, go to save her before the technique, you know, that type of thing. But yeah, it's very cool visually, because now they're on a mountain, kind of doing the meditation, but when he is about to unlock the chakra, he's like in the stars, he's in the cosmos, walking along the energy pathway to the cosmic version of himself, like in the Avatar state. And he's right about to kind of enter the kind of sphere of the Avatar state, until, he has that sort of everything is connected connection and senses that Katara is in danger. He immediately leaves the process, stops it, and we get the guru calling out that if you stop this process now before it's done, you will basically lock the chakra and you won't be able to go into the Avatar state at all. So even if he was in danger, it wouldn't activate. Blocked it worse than it kind of ever has been before. Is this the choice he's going to make? And it is. So yes, it's the mistake kind of prior to the finale here of he's prioritizing his attachment over the skill that would probably help them, but you get it, I suppose, in the moment. He's not ready to understand the significance of this chakra just yet. But what are your thoughts on this scene here, Cosmic Aang?
Yeah. I mean, I think, like you're saying, he really isn't sort of at that stage in his journey here. The overall sort of, you know, visual representation of it, I think, is done really well, and it's cool to get to see that done, you know, sort of later on as well. And this is the first sort of instance of it, but him sort of in space, in the sort of, you know, ether, the energy flow of things, and sort of, you know, being able to sort of reach almost to his sort of, you know, true full potential self here. But I don't know, it makes me wonder if it's because he was in the space that he was able to sort of, you know, idea of the connection of Katara and sort of her turmoil, her being sort of captured in that moment there. You know, who knows for sure, you know, would he have got that, you know, sort of, I guess, vision, regardless of the situation. You know, the choice that he made there would have been one regardless of how, you know, he got the information or what he thought was going on. At least at this moment in time, he's definitely not really to, you know, sort of let go of things and is too sort of attached to things, which, you know, kind of makes sense with everything that he's gone through so far.
And then we do get some final scenes to wrap up the episode. Sokka is preparing to leave with Hakoda on the next Southern Water Tribe mission. He says to his father that he wants to prove himself, but Hakoda says, "You don't need to. I'm already proud of you. That's why I put you in charge when I left." And right as this is happening, Aang arrives back, grave look on his face. Sokka realizes, like, oh, something's gone wrong. I I have to go with him. That's my destiny type thing. So he gets his moment with his father, but he has to kind of leave straight away. But it's for the team, so they're going to do it. They head back to Ba Sing Se. Fun moment where like they do everything I think they need to in the couple of scenes with Sokka and Hakoda ahead of like he'll come back in later in book 3, which will be cool. But they do everything they need to here, and yeah, the team needs to be together for the finale, so they make the right choice here. But your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, I think, it does, I guess it makes sense. I mean, I think, they weren't ready to really be, separated from each other, for any sort of like extended period of time, even though they had, very important things to do. And I think they were valid and worth them sort of, breaking off for, these sort of, little bit of time here. But yeah, the core group really needs to sort of work together, and they work well as a unit here. So I think it makes sense to sort of get them back together here. Sokka being able to sort of just realize from the look of things how potentially serious the situation is if Aang sort of ended his journey from his sort of souped up avatar ability training to sort of come back to him.
Next scene is Azula is brought before Long Feng by the Dai Li. He plans to take control again, and basically the deal is going to be that, hey, you have access to the Earth King, you have like freedom, but I can give you the Avatar. And so Azula says she's listening. She's taken off. There's some sort of a deal that's going to happen, but it's clear that she has her own plan. She's secretly in control of this situation. This is going exactly the way she wants to, even though it seems like Long Feng has the upper hand. And we'll see how that plays out in the next episode. But really cool stuff to see the kind of the two main scheming villains trying to out-scheme each other here. And it's like, we don't know what Azula's full plan is, but we kind of have this sense that like, yeah, I don't think Long Feng is up to Azula's standards, but he is still pretty good. What exactly is going to happen here? But what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah. I wonder if we really, how much of a hierarchy of bad people, in terms of their abilities, we really thought of at the time. But I think, Azula just being a more interesting character, I think we give her, more of the gravitas of, being the better schemer in this situation. But regardless, you can both see that they're going to try to use the situation to their sort of advantage here. Because I mean, Long Feng, he's still in prison, but he's clearly thinks he has the upper hand, having Dai Li sort of following his command, despite where he's at this current time. So no, I really like this as a way to sort of bring things to a close at the end of the episode.
And very last scene is Iroh receives a letter to kind of like serve tea to the Earth King, a great honor that he's very happy about. Zuko seems to be too, but there's obviously the sense now that like, has this actually come from the Earth King, or is this kind of part of a bigger plan overall, that this brings Iroh into contact with like a lot more of the characters, that like this feels like, yeah, this is going to be Iroh and Zuko coming into contact with Azula, everyone else. And yeah, Zuko's time in his kind of peaceful life post metamorphosis is quickly coming to an end, and it's like, it's kind of notable that the episode sort of ends on that kind of odd cliffhanger of like, yeah, like we won't get to deal with happy Zuko for that long. But your thoughts on the final scene here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely feels like, oh, this is the best thing ever for them. But in reality, that there's more schemes going on behind the scenes, and that's sort of why they're sort of getting this sort of, thing and able to sort of serve the king tea, which, I guess, considering Iroh and sort of his background, this would seem like a really sort of, into him, considering he did try to go there and sort of take over things. He's completely 180 and he's just happy to serve. So it's funny to see that sort of, thought process now, considering things in the past. But yeah, there's a lot going on.
But yeah, that is the episode. Obviously that means next time out we're going to be doing Crossroads of Destiny 220, the book 2 finale, big episode. But we're also going to be doing on the Korra side of things, K307 original Airbenders. So we actually get a bit of a side plot, but it more relates back to like the plot of early book 3. So that's interesting. So there'll be the two for the next episode of the podcast, where hopefully in terms of news we'll have stuff like Comic-Con schedule maybe, but we're just waiting for news. But otherwise, yes, that has been episode 292 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.